Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into a world where the mud never fully dries. The letters from home take months to arrive, and the definition of survival isn't about dodging danger once, but doing it repeatedly while pretending it's ordinary. You're stepping into the era that shaped Adrian Carton de Wiart, an officer who seemed to collect injuries the way other men collected medals. And you, if you'd been there beside him, probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your local time and where you're listening from in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture the late 19th century drifting toward the turn of the 20th, when Adrian Carton de Wiart was a boy moving between continents. He was born in 1880 in Brussels, though he would eventually claim Britain as the center of his allegiance. His childhood wasn't shaped by gunfire, not at first, but by expectation, travel, and the quiet rigidity of privilege. His father, Léon, was a Belgian lawyer of means, and the household operated on a schedule that didn't bend easily. Meals were taken at precise hours with predictable menus: breads, cured meats, seasonal vegetables boiled until softness, perhaps broth or thin stews on cooler days. Domestic staff managed linens and cleaned brass fittings that dulled under coal dust. The scent of wax polish and wool was constant. Education meant routine rather than excitement. Adrian studied at finishes of schooling in England, where morning prayers marked the beginning of each day, whether or not anyone believed they mattered. Uniforms were stiff, woolen, and worn even in muggy rooms with poor ventilation. His classmates learned Latin declensions and the mechanics of empire, as if both were inevitable. Corporal punishment was not dramatic punishment so much as standard correction, delivered with canes kept in cold storerooms that smelled of damp chalk and varnished desks. Over time, the daily rhythms of education and travel instilled in him a calm familiarity with discomfort. European cities during this era were knitted together with steam and paper. Telegraph lines hummed overhead. Trains used timetables printed with ink smudges and corrections scribbled in margins by station clerks. Adrian would have seen harbours choked with cargo: coal, timber, salted fish, barrels of pitch, grain sacks stacked in precarious towers, and crates marked with destinations across Africa, India, or the Caribbean. The logistics of empire were not heroic. They were spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed, kept in ledgers by men hunched over tables beneath oil lamps. Every shipment required signatures, seals, and sometimes bribes paid quietly to inspectors to keep cargo moving. By his late teens, Adrian left studies at Oxford to enlist in the British Army during the Second Boer War. Even this decision wasn't surrounded by the fanfare people imagine. Recruitment papers were filled out with dull tools, sometimes in offices that smelled of mildew. Soldiers were assigned to companies based not on glory, but on available space and needed roles. Uniforms arrived in crates poorly sorted by size, so tailors adjusted hems and button placements by hand. A new recruit might spend days doing nothing more than marching, cleaning rifles, or standing in lines waiting for medical checks that involved little more than a glance at teeth and lungs. South Africa during the Boer conflict was harsh in ways that don't lend themselves to drama, only endurance. The sun was relentless. Canvas tents baked during the day and gathered frost at night. Water supplies came from wells or boreholes shared with animals, and men developed stomach ailments from contamination they couldn't detect. Rations were tinned meats with too much salt, hardtack biscuits that chipped teeth, and the occasional addition of onions or dried peas that never fully rehydrated. Fires were dug into pits shielded from wind, and cooking pots were blackened with soot that never fully came off. Letters from home were folded into pockets and read until the creases tore. Transporting troops and equipment required oxen, mules, and wagons whose wheels split under strain. Roads were tracks carved by repetition rather than design, and rainfall turned them into mudslicks that trapped everything. Medical tents stored bandages treated with carbolic acid, morphine in carefully measured doses, and instruments sterilized by boiling water when time allowed. Amputation wasn't portrayed as tragedy so much as logistical necessity to prevent infection. Corpses were buried in shallow graves, often without markers, and sometimes exhumed by animals overnight. Soldiers learned not to look too closely at disturbed soil. Adrian was wounded multiple times in that war, though in his later accounts he rarely dwelled on the pain. He was shot in the stomach and groin early on, which today would likely be fatal without modern surgical intervention, but then amounted to field dressings and luck. Men with bandaged torsos still performed camp duties if they could stand, and the Army's records reflected injuries only in penciled notes next to names that blurred in damp ledgers. Being wounded didn't grant rest so much as a shift in expectations. You might carry buckets instead of rifle, or hold bandages for the surgeon. Between engagements, the soldiers passed hours in maintenance tasks. Rifles were cleaned with cloth scraps dipped in oil. Saddles were repaired with crude stitching, done by men who had never sewn anything before. The smell of leather mixed with the metallic tang of gun oil and the sourness of sweat-soaked uniforms. Clothing was rarely washed properly. Instead, it was beaten against rocks near water sources, or brushed and rebuttoned, carrying stains from soil and blood. Boots cracked and were patched with strips of fabric or bits of rope, keeping out dust but never fully comfortable. The administrative side of war required endless calculation. How many men fit in a cart, how much fodder a horse needed, how many days' rations remained before supply lines had to be re-established. Colonels and quartermasters spent evenings poring over inventories in dim tents lit by lanterns that flickered with every draft. Ink froze in colder conditions, and clerks warmed inkwells with their hands. Mistakes in count could mean starvation or mutiny, though more often it resulted in extended periods of hunger and ration dilution, with flour stretched by mixing in cornmeal or pulverized dried roots. Adrian's worldview hardened not through heroics, but through routine injury and persistence. After South Africa, he continued service in various postings, each defined by tedium wrapped around bursts of violence. In Somaliland in 1914, he famously lost his left hand after being wounded in the arm and face. But the days around that incident were shaped by patrols through arid terrain, negotiations with tribal leaders who had seen empires rise and vanish, and constant concerns about water and shade. Camels carried supplies in caravans that moved so slowly men could walk alongside them and still appear restless. Military command in that era valued obedience and paperwork as much as battlefield performance. Officers tracked promotions and honors through written recommendations sealed with wax, stored in metal cabinets inside barracks where dust coated everything. The men responsible for communications rolled and unrolled maps that cracked at the folds. Telegraph offices clattered with messages in code, which then had to be transcribed and relayed by hand. When cables broke, either by accident or sabotage, runners carried messages across terrain where shoes eroded against limestone or sand cut into foot wraps through split seams. Carton de Wiart's resilience gained quiet notice, but attention in the British Army often expressed itself in assignments rather than accolades. He was sent where needed, rarely with choice. Rail transport was the spine of Empire logistics, and soldiers spent long hours in cramped train compartments with wooden seats worn smooth by thousands of uniforms. The air smelled of coal, varnish and smoke. Windows stuck in tracks, so ventilation was inconsistent. Food during travel consisted of tins, bread, and sometimes jam, if quartermasters had secured it through formal supply or informal exchange. On nights when encampments were temporary, shelters were assembled with planks and corrugated metal sheets carried on wagons. Nails were reused until bent beyond salvage. Fires for warmth were rationed based on fuel availability, and smoke from wet wood settled in lungs, causing chronic coughs misdiagnosed as minor irritation. Men slept on bedrolls filled with straw or dried grasses collected from nearby fields, replaced only when lice infestations became unbearable. Diaries from this period speak less of fear and more of exhaustion, of the monotony of watch rotations, and the constant requirement to check equipment even when nothing seemed immediately threatening. By the time the First World War began, Carton de Wiart had already experienced injuries that would end many careers. Yet he returned to service willingly, carried along by the inertia of military life. The lead-up to the Great War involved mobilizations that were more clerical than dramatic. Papers stamped in triplicate, rank confirmations, inventory requisitions. Horses were inspected for soundness of hoof and muscle. Machine guns were disassembled and reassembled by men who had memorized each part number. Barracks smelled of polish, latrine disinfectants, and steam from communal wash basins. What most people don't picture is the endless tallying of numbers. The tonnage of coal needed to run a camp's boilers, the cubic meters of water required per day for drinking and cooking, the linen count for hospital cots, the crate inventory for munitions. Adrian moved within that machinery, one officer among many, shaped by days when nothing happened except the scratching of pens and the clink of tin cups. Even the anticipation of conflict had its own slow cadence. Soldiers drilled on parade grounds where grass struggled to grow. Boots left imprints that filled with rainwater and froze overnight before melting again under weak daytime sun. The medical realities were dull and grim. Antibiotics were not yet available, so infections were managed with poultices and hope. Tetanus vaccinations existed but weren't universal. Frostbite, trenchfoot, and dysentery were routine rather than exceptional. The smell of latrines dug too shallow lingered near supply depots. Soap was issued in brittle blocks that cracked in cold air. Linen bandages were boiled and reused until threadbare, marked with faded inks to track how many times they'd been cleaned. Doctors and nurses worked by candlelight when generators failed, their hands stiff from scrubbing in cold water before procedures. Carton de Wiart's manner is often described as stoic, but it's easy to overlook that stoicism was common among his peers, an adaptation to a world where injury and discomfort were constants. He was not unique in seeing comrades lose limbs or succumb to infection. What set him apart was his insistence on returning to active duty repeatedly. Yet those returns were processed like any other personnel matter. Medical boards convened, reports filed, signatures collected. He likely sat in waiting rooms with other officers, listening to the scuff of boots on linoleum floors and the ticking of clocks mounted on walls, stained by coal smoke. If you imagine heroism as loud, you'll miss what actually shaped his path. Repetition, administration, logistics, and environments where survival meant adapting to the unchanging discomfort of military life. Every advancement in his career was stamped on paper, stored in files that might never be read again. Every injury meant bandages, reports, and reassignment processes that unfolded slowly. His world was defined by individuals working through tasks so mundane, cleaning weapons, inventorying rations, writing orders, that history books often leave them out entirely. But those tasks kept everything moving, including him. And if you were there with him, performing the same routines, would you still feel the pull to stay? Or would the weight of constant administration erode your will long before the gunfire did? The first months of the First World War did not erupt with the noise that hindsight assigns to them. Mobilization was mostly a matter of trains, manifests, billets, and mapping storage space for incoming regiments. Adrian Carton de Wiart was among officers funneled into this massive structure, where schedules overruled instinct and orders circulated as typed sheets passed from clerk to adjutant to company commander. The air inside administrative huts was heavy with pipe smoke, and the dust of paper rubbed thin by handling. No one talked much about strategy around the rank and file. They talked about socks, crates, pack animals, and how long it would take to march to the next staging area on substandard roads. In France and Belgium, the transformation of farmland into organized war zones happened in layers. Villages near the front were stripped of livestock and supplies with formal receipts that rarely led to reimbursement. Roads buckled under the constant passage of artillery wagons, ambulances, and infantry columns. Dust rose in summer and clung to skin and fabric until everyone's appearance dulled to a single muted shade. In wet weather, the same roads collapsed into sludge that pulled at boots and wheels until men had to push carts by hand, pausing to scrape mud off spokes with broken knives. Carton de Wiart oversaw men who were expected to keep moving regardless of conditions, because timetables rarely adjusted to reality. Artillery units identified firing positions using survey tools that came out of padded boxes packed with brass compasses, folding scopes, pencils, rulers, and protractors. The men responsible for these measurements carried notebooks coated with wax to repel damp. Written descriptions of terrain used phrases like copse of trees and rise at 3 degrees, but the difference between a small hill and a death trap could be a matter of how churned the earth was by previous shelling. Even before combat escalated, horses suffered from harness sores and strained joints. Farriers trimmed hooves by lantern light, the metallic rasp echoing under canvas roofs that flapped in the wind. Tents designated as medical stations were never quiet. Stacks of lint dressings were tied with twine and labelled in spidery handwriting. Orderlies boiled instruments in large kettles that blackened on the outside from constant reheating. Stretcher poles were sanded between uses to remove splinters. Syringes were glass and metal, and their plungers sometimes stuck during use, requiring a firm push that drew a grunt from the person administering the dose. Morphine was administered sparingly, recorded in columns that quartermasters reviewed to audit consumption. The expectation was conservation, not comfort. Clothing issued to officers like Carton de Wiart had to be altered by batmen who carried needles and spare buttons in small tins. Torn fabric was stitched with thread that often matched poorly, producing uniforms with mismatched shades of khaki. Coats were rarely dry. Either sweat, rain, or condensation from breath in cold air kept the wool perpetually damp. The smell fused with leather straps, tallow used on boots, and the faint ammonia of latrine trenches dug at regulated distances from living quarters. Soldiers and officers alike learned to ignore the constant odor and chalky texture of grime on their hands. Meals were taken wherever space permitted. Mess tins were dented from collisions inside kits. Tea was brewed in galvanized buckets and ladled out with mugs that had enamel chips around the rim. Sugar was rationed tightly, and milk came from tins that separated if not stirred long enough. Men broke bread into thick chunks and softened it in broth if their teeth ached. Cheese, when available, was hard enough to require cutting with bayonets. Food was fuel first, comfort only occasionally. Carton de Wiart, like many officers, ate the same staples as his men when not near a permanent base, though he might have access to slightly better cuts when logistics allowed. Lines of communication strained as units moved closer to entrenched positions. Runners memorized messages in case written orders were lost or ruined in mud. Telegraph wires sagged between poles and had to be checked at regular intervals for breaks caused by shellfire or weather. When lines failed, dispatch riders mounted motorcycles or horses and navigated narrow tracks pocked with shell holes. They carried satchels with oilskin pouches to protect documents sealed with wax and string. The chance of arrival was never guaranteed, only assumed because plans required it. When the first trenches were dug, they were not yet the complex systems of later years, but shallow ditches meant to provide immediate cover. Spades struck stone or compacted earth, and progress was slow. Soil piled on the parapet collapsed after rain, mixing with straw and scraps of cloth. Officers rotated through sectors to assess needs: sandbags, timber for shoring, pumps to drain water. Carton de Wiart walked these lines not as a spectator, but as someone expected to recognize deficiencies before they became fatal. Men crouched in mud up to their shins, smoking pipes or chewing whatever they had to blunt hunger. Rats appeared quickly, gnawing at seeing. Andle stubs and scraps of meat, their presence accepted as inevitable rather than shocking. Shellfire became a background condition rather than an event. The sound varied depending on caliber and distance. Some bursts sent shrapnel skimming low, prompting men to duck instinctively even when impact was hundreds of yards away. Trench walls absorbed vibrations that rattled enamelware and caused loose soil to crumble onto blankets and packs. Incoming wounded arrived on stretchers carried by teams who stepped carefully along boards laid across flooded sections. The cries of pain were often quiet because men understood that drawing attention served no purpose. Carton de Wiart's own injuries in this period added to his growing ledger of scars. At Ypres, he was hit in the face and head, with one wound destroying his eye. The extraction and bandaging were done quickly, more to stabilize than to repair. He would later wear a patch, but at the time the priority was stopping bleeding and preventing infection. Cotton pads were held in place by bandages wound tightly enough to restrict movement. After initial treatment, he was not evacuated far to the rear. Officers were expected to return to duty unless incapacitated. Rest meant a cot in a crowded ward where coughing and murmured prayers filled the darkness. Evenings in quieter sectors allowed small acts of maintenance. Rifles were disassembled in dugouts lit by candles stuck into bottles or embedded in the dirt wall. Springs and bolts were cleaned with rags dipped in oil. Ammunition was wiped down to remove grime. The act of readiness itself took hours, repeated by habit rather than under immediate threat. Letters written home described banal details: weather, rations, brief mentions of comrades, because censor rules limited mention of place or casualties. Pen nibs cracked and had to be replaced. Ink bottles shattered if dropped on stone floors. Water management remained a crucial, often overlooked concern. Trenches flooded from rainfall and high water tables. Pump crews used hand-cranked mechanisms to divert water into channels lined with duckboards. Without consistent drainage, soldiers developed trench foot, skin whitening and peeling in layers that stank when boots were removed. Medics inspected feet daily when possible, but inspections could be delayed by shelling or orders to move. Carton de Wiart, like other officers, enforced these routines not out of compassion, but because immobility affected manpower strength. The movement of supplies followed predetermined routes that changed only when absolutely necessary. Wagons brought shells, food, bandages, rope, and tools to designated depots. The men unloading them formed chains, passing crates from hand to hand. Labels were stenciled in fading paint. Inventories were logged on forms without carbon copies. Clerks recopied lists by hand each night. If something failed to arrive, officers filed reports that might not be read for days. Improvisation filled gaps. Sandbags sewn from flour sacks, periscopes built from mirrors salvaged from ruined houses, makeshift splints carved from fence posts. Behind the lines, billets in barns or abandoned homes offered temporary rest. Straw pallets were arranged in rows. Windows were covered with tarps or boards to block light at night. Fires were prohibited indoors to avoid smoke revealing positions, so men warmed hands over braziers outside when weather permitted. The smell of manure mixed with sweat and smoke from cook fires established earlier in the day. Clothing infested with lice was deloused using steam drums when available, but many simply scratched until skin broke and scabs formed. Carton de Wiart's capacity to endure suffering without protest earned him a reputation among subordinates. Yet endurance in this context meant following the same patterns over and over: inspection, briefing, walking lines, reviewing maps, meeting logistical officers to discuss shortages. Meetings took place in dugouts with tables made from doors laid across crates. Candles illuminated smudged diagrams pinned to walls with bayonets. Men leaned over them with pencils sharpened by penknives, tracing routes and calculating distances based on outdated surveys. Food distribution near the front involved field kitchens set up in shell holes or ruined structures. Large pots of stew simmered over fires concealed with sheets of metal to diffuse smoke. Meat often arrived stringy and tough, cut from animals slaughtered hastily. Vegetables were issued dried or tinned. Bread baked behind the lines hardened quickly in cold air. Tea remained constant, brewed whenever water and fuel allowed. Utensils were shared or wiped with cloths between uses. Illness from spoiled food was common enough to be routine, logged by medics without strong reaction. The administrative layers above officers like Carton de Wiart operated from safer positions, but remained bound by paper. Orders traveled downward with delays that could span hours or days. Reports traveled upward with equal uncertainty. When mistakes were discovered, units positioned incorrectly, supplies miscounted, they were corrected quietly if possible. blame rarely moved beyond the immediate circle. The machinery of war continued not because it functioned perfectly, but because those within it adapted constantly without expecting recognition. Seasonal changes introduced new patterns. Autumn brought cold rains that turned ground to slurry. Winter froze mud into jagged ridges that made walking treacherous. Fires became essential for drying socks and warming food, but smoke risked detection. Snow was trampled into filth within hours, mixed with manure from horses and ash from burned refuse. Frostbite blackened extremities. Men wrapped hands in spare cloth and stuffed straw into boots for insulation. Carton de Wiart donned greatcoats lined with wool, but the cold still numbed fingers needed for writing and weapon maintenance. Spring brought thaw and the stench of decomposition. Bodies buried shallowly or not at all surfaced when soil shifted. Engineers expanded trench networks, adding communication and support trenches connected by duckboard paths. Dugouts were reinforced with timber beams and corrugated metal sheets, scavenged from wrecked buildings. Latrines were relocated as groundwater levels rose. Equipment rusted quickly, requiring constant scraping and oiling. Flies returned in swarms, landing on faces and food. Men swatted with gloves or cloths, resigning themselves to bites. Carton de Wiart's leadership during these times involved more observation than speech. He walked lines inspecting emplacements, noted shortages, and passed concerns to those who could act on them. He spoke to soldiers briefly, often about practical matters: boots, water, tools. Encouragement came not through words, but by presence. His bandaged eye and visible scars signaled he shared their risks. Yet his survival so far owed as much to habit and procedure as to personal toughness. Following rules regarding movement, cover, equipment, reduced exposure to danger incrementally. As the war dragged on, rotation schedules attempted to provide rest. Units were pulled back for days or weeks to camps with more permanent structures. Wooden huts housed dozens of men on raised platforms. Blankets were issued and sometimes washed. Showers existed in rudimentary form. Heated water in barrels with gravity-fed spouts. Soap rations increased slightly. Here, men received mail in bundles sorted by exhausted clerks who worked in tents piled with sacks of letters tied with string. Carton de Wiart might have read updates from acquaintances or superiors, folded and stored in pockets until disintegration. Yet rest did not erase the strain of constant readiness. At any moment, orders could arrive demanding redeployment. Equipment was kept packed or close to hand. Maps were updated daily in case of movement. Horses remained harnessed for hours at a time. Rifles stood stacked near tent entrances. Even in quieter times, inspection routines persisted. Medical checks catalogued chronic issues: coughs, joint pain, hearing loss. Few were relieved of duty unless visibly incapacitated. The wider strategic picture remained abstract to most. Conversations in dugouts rarely mentioned politics or goals. Discussions focused on immediate needs: whether reinforcements would arrive before rations ran out, when replacement boots might be issued, if rumors of improved helmets were true. Carton de Wiart received briefings outlining operations, but those briefings reduced complex plans to movements on grid squares. He executed them without illusion of clarity. The constant uncertainty became its own normal. News from other fronts arrived sporadically and filtered through rumor. Reports of battles in distant regions meant little when daily life remained unchanged. Soldiers speculated about offensives without context. Officers like Carton de Wiart incorporated these reports into planning only when orders aligned. Otherwise, information passed through minds already numbed by repetition. And through all of this, a question lingered not in words but in the routines themselves. How long can a system built on exhaustion, injury, and constant improvisation continue before one overlooked detail brings it all to a halt? The spring rains had begun in earnest by the time Carton de Wiart's unit shifted positions again. The mud, once softened by autumn downpours and winter freeze-thaw cycles, now turned into a dense, sticky paste that swallowed boots and wheels in equal measure. Soldiers learned to anticipate the resistance underfoot with each step, distributing their weight carefully to avoid plunging too deeply. Even the simple act of moving from one trench to another required methodical attention, and officers like Carton de Wiart spent long minutes assessing which duckboards were still serviceable, which had warped or cracked under winter's relentless weight, and which could support the weight of a stretcher bearing a wounded comrade. Each decision, however minor it appeared, carried practical consequences. Misjudgment could delay movement, strain personnel, or contribute to further injuries. By this time, the war had settled into a routine that was simultaneously monotonous and exhausting. Days began at dawn, often with a feeble sun barely illuminating the frost-laden ground. Men in trenches would rise, shivering, and check each other's uniforms and gear for damage sustained overnight. Boots were wiped clean, or as clean as possible, before being treated with tallow or oil to prevent cracking. Rifle barrels were inspected, oiled, and reassembled with precision, each part scrutinized for wear or misalignment. Even small failures could cascade into operational inefficiency. A misaligned bolt or a snapped strap could leave a soldier vulnerable, reduce the effectiveness of patrols, or slow the transfer of ammunition during bombardments. The provisioning of units was a constant exercise in calculation and foresight. Supply wagons, horse-drawn and sometimes motorized, trundled along rut-filled tracks, carrying tins of food, medical supplies, spare clothing, and ammunition. Quartermasters logged every crate, recording the exact quantity and condition of each item. Rations were allocated carefully, sometimes down to the gram, to ensure that none were wasted. Food was functional first, morale second. Meat, when available, was boiled until it softened, accompanied by hardtack or salted vegetables. Tea, a constant companion, was brewed in massive cauldrons over concealed fires, its bitterness mitigated by the scarcity of sugar and the imperfection of water, often drawn from stagnant puddles or streams that had been hastily filtered through cloth. Carton de Wiart's own duties expanded beyond direct supervision of men. He regularly inspected forward positions, noting where parapets had eroded, sandbags had shifted, or drainage channels were blocked. These observations were recorded in notebooks that he carried in the breast pocket of his uniform, the ink often running when rain seeped through his coat. Notes were passed up the chain to commanding officers and also circulated laterally to adjacent units. The meticulousness of this process was critical. Mismanagement of small details could have strategic consequences, though few beyond the officers were aware of the full scope of logistics required to sustain even a small sector of the front. Medical care remained rudimentary and frustratingly slow. Injuries, both minor and severe, were treated first in forward aid posts, which consisted of small dugouts lined with straw and wood. Cotton bandages were reused multiple times, boiled when possible, and applied with an efficiency dictated by necessity rather than comfort. Field dressings were supplemented by morphine or chloroform for the worst cases, though doses were carefully rationed. Amputations, when unavoidable, were performed with an economy of motion and a prioritization of survival over technique. The cries of the injured, though often quieted by shock or sedation, formed a constant background to daily life, a subtle reminder of the stakes behind the routine tasks that dominated every hour. The weather itself became a significant adversary. Spring rains were followed by periods of sun that seemed to promise relief, but often accelerated the thawing of the upper layers of mud, leaving soldiers to contend with a mixture of standing water, sticky soil, and exposed roots. Hypothermia and trench foot were common, and preventative measures were both routine and repetitive. Socks were changed when possible, feet inspected, and boots dried over fires or stuffed with straw. Men quickly learned to accept numb toes and chapped skin as a normal condition, noting only when injuries became severe enough to impede movement. Carton de Wiart observed these practices carefully, ensuring compliance not through admonishment but by example. His own hands and boots bore the same evidence of prolonged exposure. Communication lines remained precarious. Telegraph wires ran along shallow trenches or overhead poles, frequently damaged by bombardments or shifting earth. Runners were dispatched to deliver messages in person when wires failed, carrying satchels of paper tied carefully with string and wax seals. The reliability of these messages was never guaranteed. Some were lost to mud, enemy fire, or fatigue. Officers maintained logs of all communications, cross-referencing with previous dispatches and notes from subordinate units. The constant verification and re-verification of information became a daily preoccupation, less glamorous than strategy, but crucial to operational integrity. Amidst the logistical and physical demands, psychological endurance played a quiet role. Soldiers adapted to monotony, finding ways to measure time and maintain a sense of personal order. Journals were kept, not necessarily for posterity, but to record small details. The time water reached a pump, the number of rounds fired during practice, the arrival of new supplies, or the temporary repair of a collapsed duckboard. Officers, including Carton de Wiart, monitored these behaviors, recognizing that the preservation of routine, even in minor details, contributed to collective stability and survival. The presence of rats, vermin, and occasional wildlife formed another layer of constant adaptation. Rats scavenged on food scraps, gnawed at bedding, and sometimes entered sleeping quarters, eliciting only resigned swats from soldiers. Their activity, while irritating, also indirectly indicated the presence of decomposing material or nearby contamination, providing a crude, if unpleasant, early warning system for hygiene issues. Carton de Wiart noted such interactions, ensuring that temporary pest control measures, scraps burned or disposed of properly, trenches cleaned, were implemented promptly, even amid pressing operational demands. Training and readiness never ceased entirely, even when units rotated out of front-line positions. Drills continued, often in inclement weather, to maintain muscle memory and operational coordination. Weapons were repeatedly assembled and disassembled, packs repacked, and lines of march rehearsed. While the human toll of this repetitive labor was considerable, blisters, strained muscles, and fatigue, the objective was the creation of a unit capable of responding instantly to orders. Carton de Wiart personally supervised some of these exercises, ensuring that men understood both procedure and rationale. This attention to the mechanics of war, though tedious, contributed materially to unit resilience. Supplies, however, were never entirely reliable. Ammunition could be delayed, rations spoiled, or winter clothing failed to arrive in sufficient quantities. Improvisation became necessary. Sandbags were replaced with flour sacks sewn together, splints carved from broken fence posts, and periscopes assembled from salvaged glass and mirrors. Such measures, while inelegant, reflected the reality that survival often relied on ingenuity as much as discipline. Officers documented these adaptations, including them in reports to higher command as informal but invaluable intelligence about local conditions. Social hierarchies within the unit persisted quietly. Officers held authority, but respect was often earned through visible competence and endurance rather than rank alone. Men watched leaders like Carton de Wiart for both procedural knowledge and personal fortitude. Scars, bandages, and the visible results of prior engagements served as non-verbal testimony of experience. Observing these markers, soldiers calibrated expectations of leadership, forming subtle networks of trust that complemented formal command structures. Morale, though fragile, was maintained in these small, almost imperceptible ways. Seasonal cycles dictated additional labor. Spring rains softened earth for trench expansion, but increased the need for drainage, shoring, and reinforcement. Men cleared debris, repaired duckboards, and reinforced parapets with sandbags and timber. Winter damage was assessed, often revealing weaknesses in previously considered stable sections. Carton de Wiart oversaw inspections personally, noting erosion patterns, water accumulation points, and the adequacy of support structures. These evaluations were recorded meticulously, forming an ongoing archive of structural conditions that would inform future decisions. The work was tedious, yet failure to maintain these details could result in disaster. On rare occasions, minor offensives or skirmishes punctuated the routine. Even these were procedural to a surprising extent. Reconnaissance reports, artillery placement calculations, and logistical coordination dominated the preparation phase. Engagements themselves often lasted minutes, but were preceded and followed by hours of adjustment, mapping, moving supplies, documenting outcomes, and repairing damages. Casualties were treated in the field, then transported when feasible to rear hospitals. Each incident, while significant individually, blended into the ongoing rhythm of military life, reinforcing the principle that persistence and attention to minutiae were as important as heroism. Evening rituals, though informal, offered brief respite. Soldiers cleaned weapons, adjusted equipment, and sometimes wrote letters home, taking care to avoid censorship restrictions. Tea was brewed if water and fuel permitted, shared quietly among small groups. In these moments, conversations ranged from trivial observations about weather and food quality to muted reflections on personal losses or injuries. Carton de Wiart observed, participating when necessary, but primarily maintaining an awareness of operational readiness. Rest was measured, not luxurious. Sleep came in shifts on straw pallets, often interrupted by patrol duties or the occasional shell that landed nearby. Amid all these details, one persistent thought shadowed officers like Carton de Wiart. The system they maintained was fragile. Every logistical misstep, every delay in supplies, every unobserved structural weakness in a trench represented a potential failure. Yet the machinery of survival continued through repetition, vigilance, and minor improvisation. The paradox was constant. A single overlooked detail could have catastrophic consequences, yet the day-to-day survival of thousands depended on countless details executed correctly, most of which were boring, repetitive, and easily taken for granted. And as spring moved towards summer, bringing longer days and slightly warmer nights, the soldiers adapted once more, performing the same repetitive tasks with faint hope that each day completed would bring incremental progress. Yet the question that lingered silently over each inspection, each ration distribution, each repair of mud-collapsed parapets, remained unanswered. How long could endurance, habituation, and meticulous attention to routine hold back the consequences of chaos that waited just beyond the trenches? Summer arrived in its slow, predictable way, bringing with it the first sense of new grass growing in the flattened fields behind the trenches. Soldiers noticed small changes: the buzz of insects, the brightness of sun on wet earth, the taste of dust carried on warm winds. But these were fleeting comforts, temporary interruptions to the rhythm of mud, labor, and vigilance. Carton de Wiart moved among men as he had for months, inspecting parapets, observing ration distribution, and recording logistical notes. The repetition of duties, the endless attention to minutiae, persisted without pause. What distinguished officers like him was not the spectacle of action, but the quiet endurance, the ability to remain engaged and observant when even minor fatigue could compromise the unit. The trenches themselves had evolved. By this point, they were deeper, reinforced with timber and corrugated iron salvaged from nearby ruins. Water channels were carefully maintained to divert runoff from rain or thaw, but standing water still collected in pockets, requiring regular pumping or bailing. Duckboards, worn smooth and sometimes cracked, were checked multiple times daily to ensure soldiers could traverse them safely. Even the simplest inspection required walking slowly, noting displacement of earth, sagging beams, and the subtle signs of erosion. Carton de Wiart's careful documentation of these factors created a record that, while rarely cited in the heat of battle, would prove invaluable for understanding the realities of life at the front. Medical care, though rudimentary, had improved slightly due to cumulative experience. Field hospitals were better organized, with triage protocols that allowed for faster treatment of injuries, though resources remained limited. Bandages were sterilized as frequently as fuel permitted, and surgical instruments were reused with painstaking clean-ins, and boiling. Morphine and chloroform were administered with precision, carefully rationed, and recorded meticulously in ledgers. Carton de Wiart often oversaw transfers of severely wounded men, coordinating with stretcher bearers and medics, ensuring that both care and logistical flow remained uninterrupted. The work was unglamorous, but it sustained life in the environment where survival depended on constant maintenance rather than heroic feats. Supply lines continued to dictate daily existence. Wagons transporting food, ammunition, and materials were vulnerable to weather, terrain, and enemy action. Quartermasters maintained detailed inventories, noting not only quantities, but quality. Bread hardened, tins of meat dented or burst, and rations often had to be stretched with dried roots or flour. Officers monitored distribution carefully, understanding that insufficient provisions could erode both morale and effectiveness. Carton de Wiart himself took part in these inspections, recognizing that direct engagement with logistical realities reinforced credibility and enabled faster problem-solving. The summer heat intensified the challenge of hygiene. Latrines required constant maintenance. Stagnant water and accumulated waste created breeding grounds for flies and disease. Soldiers adapted to these conditions, using makeshift measures when proper facilities failed, digging temporary pits, lining them with straw, and relocating them frequently. Clothing and bedding were laundered when possible, but shortages of soap and water made it an irregular practice. Personal discipline became as critical as procedural compliance. Officers who enforced these small habits quietly contributed to broader unit health and functionality. Daily routines oscillated between extreme monotony and sudden bursts of activity. Reconnaissance missions, patrols, and minor engagements punctuated the otherwise repetitive work of inspection, maintenance, and reporting. Men traveled along narrow paths, inspecting terrain for shell craters, assessing the stability of embankments, and verifying supplies. Carton de Wiart supervised these operations, ensuring that procedures were followed and hazards identified. Even when actual combat was rare, the preparation for it consumed hours of attention and energy. Each small task, securing a tent, repairing a duckboard, adjusting a sandbag, was a potential determinant of survival in an environment where one misstep could prove fatal. Weather fluctuations continued to influence all aspects of life. Summer thunderstorms could flood trenches within minutes, forcing hasty drainage and repairs. Dust storms, common in dry periods, coated uniforms, gear, and food with fine particulate matter. Temperature swings demanded careful clothing management. Layers were added or removed to prevent hypothermia or heat exhaustion. Carton de Wiart, moving through these conditions, recorded patterns of erosion, soil saturation, and water pooling, contributing to a growing body of knowledge that would inform future operational planning. The cumulative effect of attention to these small, often overlooked details became the backbone of survival. Training and readiness remained integral. Even during quieter periods, soldiers practiced drills, weapon handling, and signaling. Maps were updated daily to reflect minor shifts in terrain, and orders were rehearsed until procedural memory was ingrained. Carton de Wiart personally oversaw many of these exercises, emphasizing discipline, accuracy, and adaptability. The monotony of repetition, combined with the ever-present awareness of potential danger, honed soldiers' ability to respond quickly and correctly under pressure. The emphasis was less on heroism and more on competence, the quiet, often invisible preparation that made the difference between life and death. Interactions among soldiers and officers were subtle but meaningful. Respect was earned through visible competence, reliability, and endurance. Carton de Wiart's scars, bandages, and history of repeated injuries signaled experience and toughness, garnering quiet deference. Leadership was as much about example as command. The daily demonstration of resilience, adherence to procedure, and consistent engagement in the repetitive tasks of survival inspired compliance and loyalty. Social hierarchies existed, but they were reinforced not only through rank, but through tangible demonstration of skill and endurance under the relentless conditions of trench life. Even minor improvements in infrastructure required meticulous attention. Repairs to parapets, reinforcement of duckboards, and adjustment of drainage channels were continuous tasks. Timber and sandbags were inspected daily, erosion patterns recorded, water pooling mitigated through manual pumping. Carton de Wiart documented each change, forming detailed notes that, while not immediately critical, provided insight for future planning and operational adjustments. The importance of these measures was rarely dramatic, Success was measured in the absence of catastrophe rather than the presence of spectacle. The psychological demands were constant. Soldiers developed mechanisms to cope with monotony, repetitive labor, and the ever-present risk of sudden violence. Journals, letters, and small acts of personal organization, arranging supplies, cleaning boots, or cataloging minor repairs, helped maintain mental equilibrium. Carton de Wiart, though often perceived as stoic, engaged in similar practices, recognizing that personal order reinforced command authority and stabilized the broader unit. Attention to detail became a form of mental as well as physical survival. Medical considerations extended beyond the treatment of wounds. Soldiers contended with chronic fatigue, malnutrition, and exposure-related ailments. Inspections of feet for trench foot, hands for cuts, and general hygiene were routine. Officers enforced these measures consistently, understanding that minor issues, if neglected, could escalate into incapacitating conditions. Carton de Wiart's approach emphasized adherence to routine and preventative action, embedding these practices in the daily habits of his men. Health and functionality were maintained less by dramatic intervention than by unending repetition and vigilance. By the summer's end, the combination of careful planning, rigorous routine, and personal endurance had created a system capable of sustaining life amid conditions that were otherwise hostile. Yet the fragility of this system remained apparent. Any lapse, whether a delayed ration, a neglected repair, or overlooked injury, could trigger cascading consequences. Carton de Wiart's repeated survival, therefore, was not a result of luck or bravado alone, but of constant engagement with the mundane realities that underpinned the machinery of war. Looking back on this period, it becomes clear that Carton de Wiart's legacy rests in the intersection of endurance, procedural diligence, and leadership by example. His personal scars tell a story of repeated physical trials, but equally important is the record of his attentiveness to detail, his oversight of logistics, and his insistence on maintaining daily routines. The life of an officer at the front, shaped by repetition, observation, and small adaptations, demonstrates that historical impact is often grounded not in dramatic events, but in the quiet execution of countless ordinary tasks. Ultimately, his contributions highlight a broader truth about military history: the apparent heroics of battles and campers. Hygiens are inseparable from the laborious, repetitive, and often overlooked work that sustains them. Logistics, hygiene, equipment maintenance, and continuous training create the foundation upon which extraordinary actions become possible. Carton de Wiart's story reminds us that survival and effectiveness in war are not simply matters of courage, but of enduring patience, meticulous attention to detail, and relentless adaptation to circumstance. And so, as the summer faded into autumn, the soldiers continued their routines, unaware of the exact impact of their efforts on the war's trajectory, yet sustained by the very systems and habits that Carton de Wiart embodied. His life at this stage of conflict demonstrates that heroism can be quiet, cumulative, and embedded in the ordinary, leaving a legacy defined as much by process as by result, and by human resilience as much as by action. Having followed Carton de Wiart through the trenches and endless logistical routines of World War I, we now turn slightly eastward, to a quieter yet no less intricate theatre of the conflict, the daily operations and survival of soldiers stationed along the lesser-known eastern fronts. Here, life was measured not only by the immediacy of combat, but by the unrelenting demands of supply chains, weather, and the rhythms of ordinary existence under military occupation. The lines of war were less densely packed, and yet the same principles, discipline, endurance, and attention to detail, remained the backbone of survival. In the spring of 1915, small outposts along the Carpathian foothills were occupied by units composed of a mixture of infantry, engineers, and cavalry. These men were primarily Austro-Hungarian, though contingents of Allied forces occasionally passed through for training or reinforcement. Cartographic surveys from the time reveal villages scattered across valleys, separated by rivers swollen with snowmelt, roads that deteriorated quickly under repeated wagon traffic, and forests whose dense canopy offered both concealment and logistical challenges. Officers in these posts faced a dual task: maintaining military readiness and ensuring that men could survive with the limited resources available, a task made more difficult by distance from centralized supply depots. Daily routines began long before sunrise. Soldiers rose in wooden barracks, canvas tents, or repurposed farm buildings, their feet immediately meeting cold or damp floors. Clothing was layered to accommodate fluctuating temperatures. Woolen undergarments were supplemented by coarse outer coats that could be removed or tied off depending on activity. Each morning, men inspected their rifles, cleaned small arms with cloths and oil, and prepared ammunition for potential exercises or minor skirmishes. The act of cleaning a weapon, while seemingly minor, was in fact a critical daily ritual. It ensured functional readiness, reinforced procedural discipline, and occupied time in a way that mitigated idle anxiety. Breakfast was issued according to regimented schedules, with rations consisting primarily of bread, thin soups, dried meats, and occasionally tinned fruit. Water was drawn from local wells or streams, filtered through cloth to remove debris, and boiled when fuel allowed. Officers monitored these distributions to ensure equitable allocation and to prevent shortages from affecting morale. Even the act of issuing food demanded careful calculation. Tins had to be opened without spoiling contents, spoons accounted for, and leftover scraps disposed of to reduce the risk of vermin. Carton de Wiart, if stationed here, would have observed these routines carefully, noting both compliance and minor deviations, understanding that survival depended on meticulous management of seemingly trivial details. Outside mealtimes, labor fell into a structured rotation. Men cleared brush, repaired roads, or reinforced makeshift fortifications. Wood for fires was collected from nearby forests, often involving hours of chopping and carrying in packs. Engineers measured slopes for drainage channels to divert rainwater from living quarters, preventing trench foot and damp conditions from becoming epidemic. Horses and mules required feeding, grooming, and occasional veterinary care. Failing to maintain their condition could compromise the transport of ammunition, food, or even wounded personnel. Every day was punctuated by repetitive work, but each task carried a consequence. Neglect, even temporarily, could cascade into operational or human loss. The Eastern Front's climate imposed further complications. Spring rains rapidly turned dirt roads into quagmires, delaying supply convoys. Soldiers used boards or planks to create makeshift causeways, but these often needed daily inspection and repair. Cold snaps at night forced careful layering, as hypothermia could occur despite relatively mild daytime temperatures. Officers tracked these changes, noting which tents or barracks were prone to drafts, which paths became impassable, and how best to rotate labor to avoid overexertion in harsh conditions. Even minor details, like the angle of a roof overhang or the drainage of a floorboard, had operational significance when repeated day after day. Medical care in these outposts resembled that of other theaters. Forward aid stations handled minor wounds and illnesses, with serious cases transferred to larger field hospitals when feasible. Bandages were boiled or replaced, instruments cleaned meticulously, morphine rationed carefully. Soldiers faced not only battle-related injuries, but also endemic diseases, typhoid, dysentery, and influenza, whose treatment was largely preventative and procedural. Inspections for lice, skin lesions, or foot damage occurred daily, and officers enforced compliance with these routines, not only to preserve health, but to prevent the spread of conditions that could incapacitate multiple men simultaneously. Supply chains were constantly challenged. Wagons transporting food, ammunition, and spare parts traversed narrow, weather-worn roads. Drivers measured loads carefully. Horses and mules were checked multiple times a day. Any miscalculation could result in delayed deliveries, shortages at critical moments, or structural failure of transport vehicles. Officers logged every cargo manifest, cross-referenced each delivery, and anticipated delays due to weather or enemy activity. Carton de Wiart, Cano, known for his attention to minutiae, would likely have contributed detailed observations, noting how small adjustments to load distribution or route choice could improve efficiency and reduce fatigue among animals and personnel alike. The psychological endurance of soldiers was as important as physical preparedness. Repetition became a coping mechanism. The constant observance of daily routines provided stability in an environment otherwise defined by uncertainty. Men wrote letters, recorded personal notes, or engaged in minor craft work, such as repairing straps or carving small tools. Officers monitored these behaviors, recognizing that maintaining morale required a delicate balance between discipline and allowance for personal agency. Even these minor engagements, though seemingly trivial, formed the scaffold for larger operational resilience. Patrols along the Carpathian valleys were frequent, though rarely eventful. Soldiers noted terrain, tracked animal movements, and verified local population activity. Observations were recorded in notebooks or on maps, passed up the chain of command, and used to adjust defensive measures or patrol schedules. The act of observation itself was repetitive and time-consuming, measuring distances, sketching landmarks, and noting seasonal changes in vegetation. Yet these tasks, mundane as they were, underpinned both tactical planning and daily survival. The precision and continuity of such documentation were crucial. Errors could result in exposure to ambushes, delayed supplies, or other operational failures. Weather remained a constant influence. Fog settled into valleys, reducing visibility and slowing movement. Rain softened embankments, creating hazards for both personnel and transport. Soldiers monitored environmental conditions carefully, recording changes in river flow, soil saturation, and frost depth. These observations were then incorporated into daily planning, selecting routes for supply wagons, choosing positions for forward posts, and determining optimal times for patrols. The cumulative impact of these environmental assessments, repeated daily and cross-referenced over weeks, created a living record of operational terrain. Even minor engagements or skirmishes, though infrequent, required extensive preparation. Ammunition had to be assembled, weapons cleaned and calibrated, and defensive positions reinforced. Reports were logged meticulously, casualties treated immediately, and supply inventories updated. The operational tempo of small-scale action required as much, if not more, attention to detail than large battles. A single oversight could compromise the safety of an entire post. Officers like Carton de Wiart ensured that procedures were followed precisely, understanding that consistency often mattered more than bravery in determining the outcome of an engagement. Rest periods were similarly structured. Soldiers slept in shifts, ensuring that sections of the post remained continuously staffed. Bedding was maintained carefully, inspected for vermin, and rotated when possible. Officers performed spot checks, observing both compliance with protocol and the condition of individuals. Even sleep was regulated, not for punishment, but to sustain functionality in an environment where minor lapses could rapidly escalate into crises. Tea and simple meals punctuated rest periods, offering momentary comfort and a brief sense of routine amid the ongoing demands of literary life. Communication, both internal and external, was slow and painstaking. Telegraph lines were vulnerable to environmental damage and sabotage. Runners frequently carried messages over difficult terrain when electronic communication failed. Orders were verified, documented and re-verified, often taking hours or days to reach the intended recipients. Carton de Wiart, as an officer accustomed to meticulous record-keeping, would have noted discrepancies, delayed reports, and environmental hazards, ensuring that contingency plans were in place. The reliability of communication depended less on speed than on the careful execution of routine protocols and verification procedures. Through all these details, food distribution, equipment maintenance, health inspections, environmental monitoring, and structured patrols, soldiers maintained a fragile equilibrium. Their survival relied not on individual heroism, but on consistent attention to procedure, endurance through monotony, and quiet adaptation to circumstances. Even in the absence of major offensives, the daily labor of preparation and maintenance constituted the essential work of war. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified this principle. Their effectiveness stemmed from their capacity to integrate observation, discipline, and resilience into the continuous, unglamorous rhythm of military life. And yet, despite the strict routines and constant oversight, a question persisted in the minds of those who observed the system most closely. Could this fragile balance hold if unforeseen pressures, be they environmental, logistical, or human, were introduced? The Eastern Front, quieter than the Western trenches, yet no less complex, presented challenges that were subtle and cumulative, leaving officers and soldiers alike to navigate uncertainty with nothing more than methodical diligence and steady perseverance. The early summer weeks on the Eastern Front were characterized by a delicate interplay of activity and waiting. Soldiers moved along the Carpathian foothills, attending to daily tasks while remaining acutely aware of the unpredictable environment that could transform minor inconveniences into major crises. Roads continued to deteriorate under the constant passage of wagons, horses, and men, while the soil itself shifted with repeated rainfall, creating ruts and gullies that demanded continual repair. Officers tracked these conditions carefully, cataloguing problem areas and scheduling labor rotations to prevent collapse. Each day, men inspected wooden planks, sandbag walls, and shallow drainage channels, their efforts measured less by visible progress than by the maintenance of stability. Supply management remained a cornerstone of daily life. Wagons carried ammunition, food, and equipment. But the fragility of transport routes meant that even small delays could cascade through the system. Drivers maintained careful logs of distances traveled, loads carried, and animal performance. Horses and mules were inspected multiple times per day. Their health directly affected the speed and reliability of transport. Officers coordinated these logistics, calculating both immediate needs and anticipated contingencies. Carton de Wiart, had he been stationed here, would have meticulously recorded deviations from planned schedules, noting how minor delays in fuel, fodder, or spare parts influenced the operational tempo. Routine inspections extended beyond logistics to personal readiness. Soldiers checked uniforms, boots, and gear before each patrol or work shift. Rifles and sidearms were cleaned, ammunition accounted for, and minor repairs made using whatever materials were available. Small errors, an overlooked loose strap, a misaligned bolt, a poorly oiled rifle, could compromise BKR. Both individual safety and unit efficiency. Officers emphasized the importance of these details repeatedly, often supervising mundane activities personally, reinforcing the principle that consistency and attention to procedure were essential to survival. Medical vigilance continued in parallel with logistical oversight. Forward aid stations treated minor injuries and illnesses, while more severe cases were transferred to field hospitals when possible. Bandages were sterilized, splints fashioned from local wood, and morphine rationed carefully. Endemic illnesses, typhoid, dysentery, influenza, demanded strict hygiene practices. Soldiers were inspected for lice, skin lesions, and early signs of trench foot. Officers enforced these inspections rigorously, understanding that neglect could incapacitate multiple personnel simultaneously. Preventative measures were emphasized, creating routines that were repetitive, detailed, and necessary for continued functionality. Weather remained a persistent variable. Heavy rains flooded low-lying trenches and made roads impassable. Soldiers adjusted schedules to accommodate mud and water, reinforcing embankments and shoring up temporary bridges. Even minor changes, wind direction affecting the dispersal of smoke from cook fires, soil erosion under repeated trampling, were recorded and addressed. Officers tracked these variables carefully, scheduling maintenance work and adjusting patrols accordingly. The interaction between environmental factors and operational readiness was continuous and subtle, requiring sustained observation and adaptation. Patrols were often uneventful, but served multiple functions: monitoring enemy movement, scouting terrain, and reinforcing discipline. Soldiers moved deliberately, noting landmarks, measuring distances, and recording observations in field notebooks. Cartographic records were updated regularly, reflecting changes in rivers, vegetation, or paths. Though these activities appeared repetitive, their precision was critical. Errors in mapping or observation could result in misdirected patrols, delayed supply delivery, or vulnerability to ambushes. Officers emphasized accuracy over speed, reinforcing the principle that methodical work, though tedious, preserved life and operational capability. Food distribution followed strict routines. Rations were allocated based on both individual needs and unit requirements. Bread, dried meat, and tinned vegetables were staples. Tea was brewed when water and fuel were available. Officers monitored quantities closely, ensuring equitable distribution while preventing waste. Spoiled or damaged provisions were logged, replaced when possible, and accounted for in supply reports. Soldiers adhered to these routines with precision, understanding that minor deviations, hoarding, misallocation, or spillage could disrupt overall stability and compromise morale. Hygiene required constant attention. Latrines were maintained, water sources inspected, and clothing laundered whenever feasible. Soldiers cleaned boots and uniforms, sometimes in freezing streams or shallow puddles, accepting discomfort as part of survival. Officers performed spot inspections, noting compliance and offering guidance where necessary. Even trivial lapses, dirty socks, neglected washing, or unclean utensils had broader implications, contributing to illness or reduced effectiveness. Discipline in mundane matters became as important as skill in combat. Training continued despite monotony. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, and small-scale maneuvers. Drills reinforced habit and procedural memory, ensuring that each individual could respond correctly under stress. Carton de Wiart, accustomed to meticulous oversight, would likely have observed these sessions, correcting technique and noting areas for improvement. Repetition reinforced competence and stability. Success was measured not in spectacle, but in predictable, reliable performance. Interactions within units remained subtle but significant. Officers earned respect through endurance, competence, and visible attention to detail. Carton de Wiart's own reputation for resilience and observant leadership set standards that influenced behavior without explicit command. Soldiers observed habits, copied procedures, and internalized routines, creating a self-reinforcing system of discipline. Morale, fragile and influenced by environmental and logistical conditions, depended on the stability of these social and procedural networks. Even minor repairs demanded ongoing attention. Wooden parapets, sandbag walls, and drainage channels required daily inspection. Erosion patterns, water pooling, and structural weaknesses were recorded and addressed. Officers documented each repair, noting materials used, labor invested, and anticipated future issues. While individually unremarkable, these actions cumulatively contributed to unit survival, illustrating that operational success relied on sustained, repetitive care rather than occasional heroics. Rest periods were carefully scheduled. Soldiers slept in shifts, allowing sections of posts to remain continuously staffed. Bedding was inspected, rotated, and occasionally replaced. Officers conducted checks, verifying both compliance and the condition of individuals. Even sleep was regimented, designed to maintain readiness under conditions where any lapse could have serious consequences. Tea, minimal rations, and quiet conversation punctuated rest, providing brief psychological relief while reinforcing social cohesion and shared routines. Communication remained a challenge. Telegraph lines, vulnerable to environmental damage and occasional sabotage, often failed. Runners carried messages on foot or horseback, sometimes for hours across difficult terrain. Orders were verified and re-verified, with delays accounted for in operational planning. Officers like Carton de Wiart emphasized redundancy, multiple channels, repeated confirmation, and careful record-keeping. Consistency and verification, though tedious, were essential to prevent miscommunication and maintain unit cohesion. Cumulative stress from monotony, physical labor, and environmental factors influenced mental health. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms, journaling, minor craft work, or quiet observation. These activities maintained morale and mental equilibrium, offering a sense of personal agency. Officers monitored behavior, intervening when necessary but generally relying on the self-regulating habits of trained men. The management of psychological endurance was as critical as physical preparedness. Seasonal changes affected labor and daily routines. Rivers rose, vegetation thickened, and insects multiplied. Patrols required adjustment, supply routes became more challenging, and disease vectors proliferated. Officers tracked these shifts, scheduling work to minimize risk and maintain operational effectiveness. Routine, repetition, and vigilance were adapted to seasonal demands, demonstrating the interplay between environmental awareness and procedural discipline. Even minor engagements required extensive preparation. Ammunition, weapon maintenance, and defensive positions were reviewed meticulously. Reports of outcomes, injuries, and resource usage were recorded and transmitted. Officers emphasized procedure over improvisation. Predictable, careful action ensured survival in unpredictable circumstances. The combination of preparation, observation, and repetition constituted the primary defense against failure. Through all these routines, soldiers maintained a delicate equilibrium. Success was measured in stability, not in dramatic feats. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified this principle, integrating observation, discipline, and endurance into the daily rhythm of survival. The effectiveness of the unit depended not on occasional heroics, but on continuous attention to minor details, a persistent labor that was invisible in the grand narrative, but vital in practice. Yet despite meticulous attention to detail, questions remained unresolved. Could this fragile balance withstand the sudden introduction of unforeseen pressures? Environmental, logistical, or human? The Eastern Front, quieter than the Western trenches yet no less demanding, tested endurance, observation, and adaptability in ways that were subtle, cumulative, and largely invisible. Soldiers and officers alike continued their routines, fully aware that survival was contingent on the ongoing, unremarkable execution of countless small tasks. By midsummer, the Carpathian foothills had settled into a rhythm dictated as much by environment as by orders. Soldiers rose at dawn, often greeted by a damp mist clinging to the valleys, saturating uniforms and making even routine movement cumbersome. The smell of wet soil, wood smoke from cooking fires, and the faint tang of livestock mingled in the air. Officers like Carton de Wiart, accustomed to meticulous observation, noted subtle changes, the shifting of embankments under repeated rain, slight variations in river flow, or the growing density of underbrush along patrol routes. These minor observations, recorded in journals or official logs, fed into broader operational strategies and informed decisions about supply routes, defensive positions, and rotation schedules. Daily inspection of gear remained a central focus. Rifles were disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled. Ammunition counted and stored carefully. Soldiers checked boots for water damage, socks for signs of trench foot, and coats for excessive wear. Even the minutest imperfection, an ill-fitted strap, a slightly warped stock, was noted, as it could cause operational inefficiency or injury. Officers monitored these inspections, correcting errors, demonstrating proper technique, and ensuring that repetition became habit. The emphasis was on reliability. Survival was often the result of methodical consistency rather than dramatic action. Work detail in this period extended beyond immediate survival. Trenches and posts required reinforcement, wooden beams replaced, sandbags refilled, drainage channels cleared of debris. Engineers assessed soil stability and modified defensive structures accordingly. Even minor repairs were documented, forming a continuous record of structural integrity over time. Men performing these tasks moved with a sense of procedural rhythm, each action serving both immediate and long-term purposes. Officers like Carton de Wiart oversaw these tasks directly, understanding that meticulous maintenance prevented small failures from escalating into critical problems. Food supply remained a complex concern. Wagons transported bread, tinned meat, dried vegetables, and occasionally fresh produce when local conditions allowed. Officers monitored both quantity and quality, ensuring equitable distribution while avoiding waste. Soldiers consumed meals at scheduled intervals, coordinating consumption to preserve energy and maintain readiness. The careful management of resources extended to water as well. Filtration, boiling and rationing were constant considerations. Even minor lapses in food or water management could cascade into illness, fatigue, or diminished operational capacity, highlighting the significance of routine diligence. Hygiene and medical readiness were integral to ongoing survival. Latrines were cleaned and relocated regularly to prevent contamination. Bedding inspected and replaced when possible. Clothing laundered or aired to reduce disease vectors. Soldiers were checked for lice, sores and foot injuries, and minor problems treated before they could escalate. Field hospitals, though rudimentary, handled more serious cases with triage, bandaging, and basic surgical interventions conducted under constrained resources. Officers enforced adherence to these practices, recognizing that preventative care was far more effective than reactive treatment. Environmental awareness became a continuous task. Fog, rain, or sudden temperature swings could affect mobility, visibility, and morale. Soldiers recorded river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation density to anticipate potential logistical issues. Patrol routes were adapted to accommodate these conditions, and supply deliveries recalibrated accordingly. Officers documented patterns, combining personal observation with reports from subordinates to maintain situational awareness. Even minor details, such as the incline of a path or the angle of a bridge support, could determine whether a supply wagon arrived intact or required emergency intervention. Training and procedural rehearsal remained critical. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, and emergency maneuvers repeatedly, ensuring that muscle memory compensated for fatigue or stress. Officers emphasized precision over speed, recognizing that errors under pressure could have fatal consequences. Drills were repeated until actions became automatic, embedding discipline and predictability into daily life. Carton de Wiart's experience and attention to detail reinforced these routines, demonstrating that endurance, observation, and repetition were essential qualities for operational readiness. The social dynamics within the unit were subtle but impactful. Respect was earned through demonstrated competence, endurance, and adherence to routine. Officers like Carton de Wiart served as living examples of these values, their visible scars, injuries, and repeated labor underscoring the seriousness of their authority. Soldiers observed, adapted, and internalized these lessons, creating informal hierarchies of trust and reliability alongside formal military rank. This network of behavioral reinforcement complemented procedural discipline, sustaining morale in conditions defined by monotony and constant vigilance. Communication continued to challenge efficiency. Telegraph lines remained fragile. Environmental damage and enemy interference could interrupt messages. Runners carried dispatches across difficult terrain, with redundancy and verification protocols ensuring accuracy. Officers carefully documented both outgoing and incoming communications, noting discrepancies or delays. Accuracy and consistency were prioritized above speed, with the understanding that minor errors could propagate into serious operational failures. Carton de Wiart's personal habit of recording even small observations ensured that every piece of information was accounted for, cross-checked, and integrated into broader operational planning. Even minor military engagements demanded extensive preparation. Ammunition was checked, weapons inspected, and defensive positions strengthened. Patrols and reconnaissance required careful planning, recording observed terrain, and mapping minor shifts in riverbanks, tree growth, or soil composition. Each skirmish was brief in action, but involved hours of preparation and post-action analysis. Officers emphasized repetition, observation, and detailed documentation, recognizing that these elements preserved life more effectively than improvisation or boldness alone. Physical endurance remained an ongoing concern. Soldiers engaged in repetitive labor, moving supplies, reinforcing posts, clearing paths, while managing fatigue and environmental stress. Hydration, nutrition, and rest were carefully monitored, as lapses could compound injuries or illness. Officers oversaw rotations, ensuring that no individual was overexerted while maintaining sufficient manpower for operational demands. Carton de Wiart, accustomed to enduring extreme conditions, likely contributed both practical insight and motivational presence, emphasizing resilience and procedural consistency over display or rhetorics. Seasonal changes continued to shape daily activities. Increased sunlight accelerated the growth of underbrush, complicating patrol routes and necessitating more frequent maintenance. Rainfall patterns influenced river levels and soil stability, affecting both logistics and tactical planning. Officers recorded these environmental data meticulously, integrating them into operational decisions regarding supply distribution, patrol timing, and the reinforcement of positions. Even minor environmental changes were logged and analyzed, illustrating the constant interplay between natural forces and human survival. Cumulative stress, both physical and psychological, required careful management. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms, journaling, repairing small personal items, engaging in quiet observation, or following repetitive routines. These activities helped maintain morale, reduce anxiety, and preserve attention to procedural detail. Officers monitored behaviors subtly, encouraging self-regulation while intervening when necessary. The management of mental endurance was as critical as physical preparedness. In a theater where environmental and logistical uncertainty prevailed, minor lapses could have amplified consequences. Despite this meticulous attention to routine, uncertainty remained a persistent challenge. Weather, logistical failures, illness, and potential enemy action all threatened the fragile equilibrium maintained by daily diligence. Soldiers and officers alike navigated this uncertainty with a combination of discipline, observation, and adaptation, recognizing that survival depended on cumulative adherence to routine rather than sporadic heroics. Each task, however repetitive or seemingly insignificant, was a vital link in a chain sustaining life, morale, and operational functionality. As summer progressed, subtle shifts in the environment and operational tempo kept officers vigilant. Changes in river patterns, forest density, and road conditions required constant reassessment of supply routes and defensive positions. Soldiers adapted daily, performing repetitive labor with awareness that even minor deviations could introduce systemic vulnerabilities. Officers like Carton de Wiart remained actively engaged in these assessments, combining personal observation with field reports to maintain a continuous understanding of the evolving operational environment. And yet, despite the rigor, diligence, and procedural discipline, questions persisted at the forefront of every officer's mind. How much longer could the fragile system of routine, observation, and adaptation hold under compounded stress? Could unanticipated environmental events, logistical disruptions, or sudden skirmishes overwhelm even the most meticulously managed operations? The Eastern Front, while quieter than the Western trenches, presented challenges that were subtle, cumulative, and often invisible, leaving survival and effectiveness contingent on the continuous, unremarkable execution of countless small tasks. As summer waned and autumn approached, the daily rhythm along the Carpathian foothills took on a slightly different cadence. Mornings were cooler, and fog lingered longer in the valleys, dampening both terrain and spirits. Soldiers continued to rise before dawn, layering clothing against the chill and inspecting gear with methodical precision. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth, smoke from morning fires, and the occasional tang of livestock confined in temporary pens. Officers moved among the men, recording observations and inspecting minor repairs, while the soldiers carried out their routines with the steady, almost mechanical diligence that had come to define survival in this sector of the front. The trenches, fortifications, and makeshift posts had matured over months of maintenance and minor adjustments. Wooden planks replaced warped boards, sandbags were refilled or reinforced, and drainage channels cleared regularly. Engineers monitored soil stability, noting erosion patterns, riverbank shifts, and water pooling in low-lying areas. Even minor structural weaknesses were logged in notebooks or official reports. Carton de Wiart, had he been present, would have meticulously inspected each detail, understanding that the subtle work of maintaining these positions was just as critical as any combat operation. Survival here was not the result of bravery in battle, but of sustained attention to small, repetitive tasks. Food distribution remained a daily exercise in precision. Wagons delivered bread, dried meat, and tinned vegetables, while officers ensured that rations were divided equitably and that no spoilage went unnoticed. Water was drawn from nearby sources, filtered and boiled whenever possible. Soldiers consumed meals at regular intervals, their routines balancing nutrition, energy conservation, and readiness. Even minor lapses, improper rationing, spoiled bread, or overlooked water contamination could compromise health and operational capacity. Officers monitored consumption closely, emphasizing the necessity of consistent adherence to routine, reinforcing the principle that survival depended on meticulous process rather than heroics. Hygiene continued as a central concern. Latrines were cleaned and relocated regularly, bedding inspected and rotated, and clothing laundered or aired to prevent disease. Soldiers were checked for lice, foot injuries, and minor wounds, treated promptly to prevent escalation. Field hospitals handled serious cases, with bandaging, splinting, and basic surgical interventions conducted under constrained resources. Preventative care was emphasized above all else. Officers, including Carton de Wiart, recognized that sustained attention to these mundane health measures was a keystone of operational effectiveness. Without them, even a small outbreak of illness could destabilize an entire post. Environmental factors demanded continuous adaptation. Fog limited visibility on patrols, rain softened roads and trails, and temperature fluctuations required careful management of clothing and shelter. Soldiers recorded observations of river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation density, integrating them into daily planning. Supply routes were adjusted to prevent delays, and patrol schedules modified to reduce exposure to hazards. Officers documented these changes, combining personal observation with reports from subordinates, ensuring that even minor environmental variations informed operational decisions. Survival was as much about understanding and adapting to natural conditions as it was about executing military orders. Training and routine drills persisted throughout the late summer and early autumn. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, and emergency maneuvers repeatedly, embedding procedural memory that compensated for fatigue or stress. Officers emphasized consistency and accuracy over speed, recognizing that even minor errors could have amplified consequences in the field. These exercises, repetitive and largely unremarkable, were nonetheless essential. Carton de Wiart's oversight would have reinforced the importance of precision, observation, and adherence to procedure, demonstrating that endurance and competence were cultivated through repetition rather than dramatic action. Social hierarchies within the units remained subtly influential. Respect was earned through demonstrated skill, endurance, and reliability. Officers like Carton de Wiart, whose visible scars and history of repeated injuries testified to experience, provided models for behavior and discipline. Soldiers observed routines, internalized expectations, and formed informal networks of trust and competence alongside formal rank structures. This social cohesion reinforced procedural discipline, maintained morale, and contributed to collective resilience, particularly during periods of monotony, punctuated by occasional skirmishes or logistical challenges. Even minor engagements required extensive preparation and detailed follow-up. Ammunition, weapons, and defensive positions were inspected repeatedly. Patrols and reconnaissance were planned with meticulous attention to terrain, vegetation, and potential hazards. Observations were recorded and cross-referenced, feeding into a broader understanding of operational environment. Officers emphasized careful, methodical preparation, recognizing that survival depended on reliable routines rather than improvisation or sporadic heroics. Each small task, draining a boathouse, trench, repairing a duckboard, or reinforcing a parapet, was a critical component of the larger system sustaining life and readiness. Physical endurance remained central. Soldiers engaged in repetitive labor, moving supplies, reinforcing fortifications, clearing paths, while managing fatigue, minor injuries, and exposure. Rotations were scheduled to prevent overexertion, ensuring that personnel remained capable of performing essential tasks. Hydration, nutrition, and rest were monitored and maintained as carefully as weapon readiness or structural integrity. Officers oversaw these rotations closely, balancing operational demands with the necessity of sustaining personnel through continuous, often unremarkable labor. Seasonal changes intensified the complexity of routine. Cooler mornings and longer shadows affected visibility and comfort. Increased rainfall or early frost altered river levels, soil consistency, and road conditions. Officers documented and adapted to these changes, modifying supply schedules, patrol timings, and work rotations. Soldiers responded through repeated, disciplined labor, performing familiar tasks in slightly altered conditions. This adaptability demonstrated that survival depended not on isolated acts of heroism, but on sustained attentiveness to environment, routine, and procedure. Cumulative stress, physical, environmental, and psychological, was managed through routine and habituation. Soldiers engaged in journaling, minor craftwork, and procedural tasks, maintaining mental equilibrium. Officers observed behaviors, intervening only when necessary, relying on the habitual structures of daily life to support morale. Repetition and predictability, though monotonous, created a framework that allowed men to function effectively under continuous pressure. The unremarkable labor of daily survival, quietly repeated over months, proved as vital as an tactical maneuver. Medical care remained an ongoing concern, emphasizing prevention as much as treatment. Soldiers' minor injuries, chronic fatigue, and exposure-related ailments were monitored continuously. Field hospitals treated more serious cases, with triage, bandaging, and surgical interventions conducted efficiently under constrained resources. Officers enforced hygiene and health practices rigorously, recognizing that minor lapses could compromise the functioning of the entire unit. Success depended on attention to detail, endurance, and the cumulative effect of countless small decisions. By the time autumn fully settled into the valleys, the work of survival had become a system of interconnected routines, maintained through observation, diligence, and adaptability. Soldiers, officers, and even animals formed a network of interdependent labor, with each task, however repetitive or seemingly trivial, contributing to collective endurance. Carton de Wiart's example, characterized by resilience, meticulous oversight, and unwavering attention to detail, epitomized the quiet, cumulative labor required to sustain life and operational effectiveness. Reflecting on this period, it is evident that the impact of careful routine, disciplined labor, and environmental awareness extended beyond immediate survival. While battles and campaigns often dominate historical narratives, the quiet, repetitive work of maintaining supply chains, fortifications, and health had enduring consequences. Officers who excelled in procedural oversight, demonstrating patience, endurance, and precise observation, enabled units to remain functional under conditions that might otherwise have led to chaos or collapse. In this sense, the legacy of figures like Carton de Wiart is measured less in conspicuous heroism than in the invisible scaffolding they provided for sustained survival and effectiveness. Ultimately, the experience of the Eastern Front highlights a fundamental truth of military history. The extraordinary depends on the ordinary. The rhythm of daily life, meal preparation, equipment inspection, sanitation, labor rotation, environmental observation, formed the foundation for both operational resilience and human endurance. Carton de Wiart and his contemporaries demonstrated that attention to routine, meticulous documentation, and consistent application of minor procedures were indispensable to the broader conduct of war. Their legacy lies in the demonstration that survival, functionality, and historical impact are often rooted in the accumulation of small, disciplined actions repeated consistently over time. As the leaves turned and the days grew shorter, the soldiers of the Carpathian posts continued their routines, performing labor that appeared unremarkable but was essential. Observing their environment, maintaining equipment, and sustaining health and readiness, they exemplified a principle of endurance that transcended any single engagement. Their work, repetitive and largely invisible to outsiders, ensured that the machinery of war remained operational, that men remained alive, and that the legacy of careful procedural attention endured beyond the immediate context of conflict. It is in these cumulative efforts, the quiet attention to detail, the patience, and the endurance, that the true measure of historical impact resides. Having observed the meticulous routines, logistical diligence, and environmental adaptations of soldiers along the Eastern Front, we now turn westward once more to examine life in a different theater where the rhythms of survival were equally dictated by procedure, endurance, and the quiet labor of daily existence. Here, in a sector that saw less combat than the front lines of France, yet remained strategically significant, soldiers navigated long stretches of forested plains, minor rivers, and small villages that offered both shelter and challenges. The subtleties of terrain, weather, and logistics shaped every action, creating a pattern of repetitive, unremarkable tasks whose cumulative effect determined both survival and operational readiness. In the early days of this deployment, men established camps along low ridges and gentle valleys. These locations were chosen for visibility, drainage, and access to nearby resources. Officers performed careful surveys, recording soil composition, slope stability, and proximity to water. Tents and temporary shelters were erected, with emphasis on uniform spacing, secure anchoring, and drainage considerations. Even small deviations, an improperly staked tent, a shallow trench for runoff, or misaligned sleeping arrangements, could influence the functionality and safety of the camp. Carton de Wiart, or an officer of similar meticulous disposition, would have supervised these installations closely, ensuring that procedural compliance became habitual among the troops. Daily routines began before dawn. Soldiers rose in staggered shifts, layering clothing to manage temperature fluctuations and inspecting personal gear. Weapons were cleaned, ammunition accounted for, and minor repairs performed. Officers monitored compliance, correcting technique when necessary, and emphasizing the importance of repetition. Even seemingly minor lapses, a loose strap, a misaligned bolt, or a slightly bent bayonet, could compromise effectiveness during patrols or emergencies. The continuous reinforcement of attention to detail became a central feature of operational survival. Food distribution followed strict protocols. Rations consisted primarily of bread, dried meat, tinned vegetables, and occasionally fresh produce sourced locally. Officers monitored both quantity and quality, ensuring equitable allocation and minimizing waste. Water was drawn from wells, filtered, and boiled when fuel was available. Soldiers consumed meals at scheduled intervals, balancing energy intake with readiness and labor demands. Minor mismanagement of rations, spillage, spoilage, or improper allocation could compromise both morale and physical capability, underscoring the importance of meticulous attention to process over improvisation. Sanitation and medical routines were central to daily life. Latrines were constructed at a distance from living quarters and regularly inspected for maintenance and hygiene. Bedding was rotated, laundered when possible, and inspected for vermin or damage. Soldiers were checked for foot injuries, minor wounds, and signs of illness. Field hospitals and aid stations managed more serious cases, administering bandages, splints, and basic surgical care. Preventative practices were emphasized over reactive treatment, as even minor lapses could compromise multiple individuals. Officers ensured strict compliance, recognizing that procedural discipline was essential for both health and operational capability. Environmental conditions influenced almost every aspect of camp life. Rain softened soil, clogged drainage channels, and slowed movement along supply paths. Fog limited visibility on patrols and during work shifts. Temperature fluctuations required careful layering and adaptation in both clothing and shelter. Soldiers recorded environmental observations, integrating them into daily planning and route selection. Officers documented these data, cross-referencing patterns over weeks to anticipate operational challenges. Survival depended on the persistent attention to these seemingly minor environmental variables, emphasizing the cumulative importance of observation and adaptability. Training and drills were constant. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, small unit maneuvers, and emergency procedures repeatedly. Officers emphasized precision and procedural memory, ensuring that muscle memory compensated for fatigue or stress. Repetition was prioritized over speed, as minor errors could have disproportionate consequences in unexpected situations. Carton de Wiart's presence would have reinforced the value of consistency, discipline, and careful oversight, illustrating that endurance and competence were cultivated through sustained, unglamorous labor rather than isolated acts of heroism. Logistics and supply management remained an ongoing concern. Wagons carried food, ammunition, and equipment, navigating roads that were vulnerable to weather and wear. Drivers monitored loads, distances, and animal health meticulously. Horses and mules were checked multiple times per day, as their condition directly affected operational efficiency. Officers coordinated schedules, anticipating potential delays due to weather, terrain, or mechanical failure. Minor lapses, overloaded wagons, inadequate feeding of animals, or inaccurate record-keeping could disrupt the flow of resources and compromise readiness. Procedural vigilance, repeated daily, ensured continuity of supply and operational stability. Even minor patrols required extensive preparation. Soldiers noted terrain, vegetation, and landmarks, updating maps and maintaining awareness of both natural and man-made obstacles. Patrols were timed to account for daylight, weather, and fatigue. Reports were recorded in detail, cataloging distances traveled, observations made, and deviations from expected patterns. Officers reviewed these records, correcting discrepancies and reinforcing standards. While patrols often appeared uneventful, their cumulative effect provided critical situational awareness, preventing small oversights from escalating into operational failures. Social cohesion and informal hierarchies remained integral to unit function. Respect was earned through reliability, skill, and endurance, reinforced through observation of daily routines. Officers like Carton de Wiart modeled discipline and procedural diligence, their personal history and visible injuries lending authority without the need for coercion. Soldiers internalized these expectations, forming networks of mutual accountability that complemented formal rank. Such social structures, subtle yet pervasive, stabilized morale and reinforced adherence to routine. Even seemingly minor maintenance tasks carried disproportionate importance. Wooden walkways, drainage channels, and shelter supports were inspected, repaired, and reinforced continuously. Small signs of wear or weakness were documented and addressed immediately. Officers maintained detailed logs, noting materials used, labor invested, and anticipated future issues. While these activities lacked drama, they were essential for preserving operational stability and preventing cascading failures. The effectiveness of the unit relied on sustained, repetitive care rather than singular high-profile interventions. Cumulative fatigue was managed through structured rotations and strict adherence to routine. Soldiers alternated between labor, patrols, meals, and rest, minimizing overexertion while maintaining functional readiness. Even minor lapses, insufficient rest, skipped inspections, or delayed meals could have compounding effects. Officers monitored these cycles carefully, ensuring that both physical and mental endurance were maintained. Procedural discipline became a tool for resilience, enabling soldiers to navigate continuous demands with minimal error. Medical and preventative care persisted as a central concern. Minor injuries were treated promptly, and early signs of illness were addressed before escalation. Field hospitals managed serious cases, performing bandaging, splinting, and emergency interventions efficiently under limited resources. Officers enforced strict hygiene protocols, ensuring that illness and minor injuries did not compromise the functioning of the unit. The cumulative effect of sustained attention to medical detail was operational longevity, illustrating the critical intersection of health, routine, and survival. Environmental adaptation remained constant. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and labor schedules to account for shifting weather patterns, river levels, and terrain conditions. Observations of wind direction, rainfall, and soil moisture were recorded, informing patrol planning and logistical scheduling. Officers used this information to anticipate challenges, modify tasks, and maintain readiness. Survival was inseparable from sustained environmental awareness, demonstrating the interdependence of observation, procedural discipline, and operational success. Through these routines, inspection, maintenance, observation, training, and labor, soldiers maintained a fragile equilibrium. Survival and readiness depended not on conspicuous heroism, but on cumulative, repeated adherence to procedure. Officers like Carton de Wiart embodied this principle, combining endurance, meticulous oversight, and consistent engagement with daily tasks to ensure operational functionality. The repetitive, unremarkable labor of daily life became the foundation upon which both individual survival and unit effectiveness rested. Yet despite these carefully maintained systems, uncertainty persisted. Environmental hazards, logistical delays, illness, or minor skirmishes could disrupt the delicate balance of daily routine. Soldiers and officers alike navigated these challenges with diligence, awareness, and adaptability. But the question remained, how resilient was this equilibrium under the pressure of unforeseen events? Even in a relatively quiet sector, the interplay of monotony, environmental variables, and operational demands created an ongoing tension, reminding all involved that survival was contingent on the unrelenting execution of countless small, repetitive tasks. As the weeks passed in this western sector, the routines of daily life continued to define survival, even in the absence of major engagements. Soldiers rose each morning to the soft pre-dawn light, moving through damp tents or wooden shelters, layering clothing to cope with the variable weather. Moisture from the previous night clung to canvas, blankets, and boots, and officers like Carton de Wiart meticulously observed the state of both men and equipment. The faint scent of wet earth, wood smoke from early fires, and the occasional tang of feed for horses filled the air. Each of these minor sensory details contributed to an understanding of environmental conditions, influencing decisions about movement, labor, and safety. Inspection of personal equipment remained a constant task. Soldiers cleaned rifles and sidearms, reassembled weapons carefully, and counted ammunition. Boots were checked for water damage, socks for early signs of trench foot, and uniforms examined for wear or weakness. Officers supervised these activities, correcting mistakes and reinforcing proper technique. Even a minor oversight, a misaligned bayonet, a loose strap, or an improperly stored cartridge could affect operational efficiency or compromise safety during unexpected events. Repetition of these inspections instilled habits of precision and accountability that were essential to survival. Daily labor extended to camp maintenance and fortification. Wooden walkways were inspected, trenches reinforced, drainage channels cleared, and temporary shelters repaired. Engineers evaluated soil conditions, measuring erosion patterns and ensuring structural stability. Even minor repairs were recorded in logbooks, noting materials used, time invested, and anticipated needs. Soldiers performed these repetitive tasks with careful attention to detail, understanding that small failures could have cascading consequences. Officers maintained oversight, ensuring that procedural diligence was continuously applied and that every minor observation informed broader operational planning. Food and water remained carefully managed. Rations consisted of bread, dried meat, tinned vegetables, and when available, fresh produce sourced locally. Officers monitored distribution, ensuring equitable allocation and minimizing waste. Water was filtered, boiled, and rationed as necessary. Soldiers consumed meals at prescribed intervals, balancing sustenance with energy conservation and readiness. Minor errors in ration management, spillage, spoilage, or misallocation could compromise health or morale. emphasizing that careful adherence to routine had direct consequences for both individual and collective endurance. Hygiene and medical vigilance were ongoing priorities. Latrines were inspected and relocated as needed, bedding rotated and aired to prevent disease, and clothing laundered or dried whenever feasible. Soldiers were examined for lice, minor wounds, and early signs of illness. Field hospitals treated more serious injuries with bandaging, splinting, and limited surgical interventions. Officers enforced preventative practices rigorously, understanding that minor lapses could incapacitate multiple personnel. The cumulative effect of strict adherence to hygiene protocols was operational resilience and longevity in a setting where environmental and logistical challenges were constant. Environmental awareness remained central to all decision-making. Fog, rainfall, and temperature variations affected mobility, visibility, and comfort. Soldiers monitored river levels, soil consistency, and vegetation density, incorporating these observations into planning. Patrols and work shifts were adapted to changing conditions. Officers documented these factors meticulously, ensuring that even minor variations informed operational decisions. Survival relied on the consistent integration of environmental knowledge into daily routines, highlighting the importance of observation, patience, and methodical practice. Training and drills were repeated with precision. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, small unit maneuvers, and emergency procedures, embedding procedural memory that allowed for reliable performance under stress. Officers emphasized accuracy and consistency over speed, reinforcing the notion that even minor errors could have amplified consequences. Carton de Wiart's attention to detail would have ensured that drills were conducted to standard, reinforcing habits of observation, endurance, and resilience. Logistical coordination continued to challenge officers. Wagons carried rations, ammunition, and equipment over roads vulnerable to weather and wear. Drivers maintained meticulous records of distances, loads, and animal condition. Horses and mules were inspected multiple times per day, as their health directly influenced operational capacity. Officers coordinated schedules and anticipated potential delays caused by environmental or mechanical factors. Minor oversights in logistics, overloaded wagons, improperly fed animals, or misrecorded inventories could cascade into shortages or operational disruption, underscoring the importance of procedural rigor and vigilance. Even minor patrols demanded careful preparation. Soldiers observed terrain, vegetation, and landmarks, updating maps and noting changes in riverbanks, underbrush, and pathways. Reports of distances traveled, anomalies, and deviations from expected conditions were recorded and reviewed. Officers cross-referenced these logs, correcting inconsistencies and reinforcing operational standards. While patrols often seemed mundane, their cumulative effect provided critical situational awareness, ensuring that small errors did not escalate into larger operational challenges. Social structures within the units continued to influence behavior. Respect and authority were earned through demonstrated competence, endurance, and procedural diligence. Officers like Carton de Wiart provided both instruction and example, their visible experience and scars reinforcing the importance of sustained effort and attention to detail. Soldiers internalized these lessons, creating informal networks of accountability alongside formal hierarchy. This cohesion reinforced routine compliance, stabilized morale, and promoted collective resilience during periods of monotony or unexpected disruption. Maintenance tasks, although repetitive, remained critical. Wooden walkways were reinforced, drainage channels cleared, and shelter supports repaired continuously. Soldiers documented the state of materials, labor invested, and anticipated future requirements. Officers supervised this documentation, ensuring that even minor observations informed decision-making. While lacking drama, these cumulative actions maintained structural integrity, operational stability, and personnel safety. The efficiency of the unit depended on consistent, repetitive care rather than sporadic interventions. Cumulative fatigue was managed through structured rotations of labor, patrols, meals, and rest. Soldiers alternated activities to prevent overexertion while maintaining readiness. Officers monitored these cycles carefully, recognizing that minor lapses, insufficient rest, missed inspections, or delayed meals could compound over time. Procedural discipline, combined with predictable routine, provided the framework for endurance and resilience in an environment defined by repetition and subtle, persistent challenges. Medical oversight remained central. Minor injuries and early signs of illness were treated promptly, while field hospitals managed more serious cases. Hygiene, preventative care, and regular inspection were emphasized, reducing the likelihood of widespread incapacitation. Officers enforced these routines rigorously, recognizing that the small, repeated acts of care were as critical as any tactical maneuver. The cumulative effect of these measures maintained both individual health and operational capacity, illustrating the value of attention to detail and repetitive labor in sustaining military functionality. Environmental adaptation was continuous. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and work schedules to accommodate rainfall, fog, and temperature variation. Observations of river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation growth informed patrols, supply movement, and defensive measures. Officers incorporated these observations into broader operational planning, ensuring that small environmental shifts did not compromise stability. Survival depended on the integration of these minor details into the daily rhythm of camp life. Through inspection, maintenance, observation, training, and procedural adherence, soldiers preserved a delicate balance between survival and operational readiness. Success was rarely measured in heroics. It depended on cumulative attention, end to routine, and the unglamorous labor of repeated effort. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified this principle, combining endurance, oversight, and engagement with daily tasks to maintain functionality across the unit. The quiet, repetitive work of ordinary survival proved foundational to broader operational resilience. Yet even as routines were maintained with diligence, uncertainty persisted. Minor environmental changes, logistical delays, illness, or unanticipated skirmishes could disrupt the fragile equilibrium of daily life. Soldiers and officers navigated these challenges with methodical attention and procedural adherence. But questions remained. Could this system withstand compounding stresses, or would unexpected variables expose vulnerabilities? In a sector of war defined less by dramatic battles than by the accumulation of small tasks, the answer remained uncertain, leaving both soldiers and officers in a constant state of cautious vigilance. By late autumn, the western sector had settled into a rhythm defined by observation, routine labor, and incremental adaptation to environmental conditions. Soldiers rose in the pre-dawn chill, moving through damp tents, wooden shelters, or temporary dugouts. Moisture from the night's condensation clung to clothing, boots, and bedding, while the faint aroma of wet earth, wood smoke, and feed for animals permeated the air. Officers moved among the troops, inspecting shelters, recording minor adjustments, and noting environmental changes. Even subtle variations in soil softness, water runoff, or tent stability were logged for future reference, as these small factors could accumulate to affect operational efficiency and safety. Daily inspections of personal equipment continued with meticulous care. Soldiers cleaned and reassembled rifles, checked ammunition, and examined bayonets, sidearms, and straps for damage. Boots and socks were scrutinized for moisture or early signs of foot injury. Officers corrected minor mistakes, demonstrated proper techniques, and reinforced repetition as a form of preventative discipline. Even small lapses, misaligned straps, neglected rifle components, or poorly packed ammunition could cascade into operational inefficiency or compromise safety. The routine repetition of inspections instilled habits of precision that became second nature over time. Work on the camp and defensive positions occupied the majority of daylight hours. Wooden walkways, shelter supports, and trenches required constant reinforcement. Drainage channels were cleared, ditches measured, and structural weaknesses repaired. Engineers continuously assessed soil stability, measuring erosion patterns, water pooling, and load-bearing capacity. Even minor repairs were logged, noting materials, labor, and anticipated future issues. Soldiers performed these tasks with deliberate focus, understanding that cumulative attention to small details maintained both survival and operational stability. Officers ensured that procedural rigor was maintained, observing every action and providing corrective guidance when necessary. Food and water management remained a structured, precise endeavor. Rations of bread, dried meat, and tinned vegetables were distributed according to strict schedules, monitored by officers for both quantity and quality. Water was drawn from nearby wells or streams, filtered, boiled, and rationed carefully. Minor lapses in ration management, spillage, spoilage, or uneven allocation could disrupt energy balance, morale, or overall efficiency. Soldiers consumed meals at regular intervals, adhering to schedule as a form of both sustenance and psychological stability. Officers emphasized the cumulative importance of consistent adherence to these routines, reinforcing the notion that small acts of care were critical to long-term survival. Sanitation and preventative medical care were constant. Latrines were relocated or maintained to prevent contamination. Bedding and clothing were inspected, laundered, and repaired when possible. Soldiers were regularly examined for foot injuries, minor wounds, or early symptoms of illness. Field hospitals treated more severe cases, applying bandaging, splints, and basic surgical interventions as required. Officers enforced these routines rigorously, emphasizing prevention over reaction. In such a context, even minor lapses in hygiene or medical attention could have consequences that extended beyond a single individual, affecting the operational capacity of the entire unit. Environmental monitoring remained integral to daily planning. Fog, rainfall, and temperature fluctuations influenced visibility, mobility, and comfort. Soldiers recorded river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation density to anticipate logistical and operational challenges. Patrol routes, supply deliveries, and labor schedules were adjusted in response to these observations. Officers integrated environmental data into operational planning, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on the ongoing assessment of minor but cumulatively significant factors. Procedural diligence in response to environmental shifts became essential, as small miscalculations could have compounding effects. Training and procedural drills persisted, emphasizing repetition and reliability over spectacle or speed. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, small unit maneuvers, and emergency responses daily. Officers ensured that accuracy and procedural memory were prioritized, correcting errors and reinforcing proper technique. Muscle memory and habit formed the backbone of operational resilience, allowing soldiers to respond predictably under stress. The importance of repeated, unremarkable practice remained a hallmark of effective leadership, ensuring that minor errors did not accumulate into operational failures. Logistical management continued to present subtle challenges. Wagons carried food, ammunition, and equipment along roads vulnerable to wear and weather. Drivers meticulously recorded distances traveled, loads carried, and animal performance. Horses and mules were checked repeatedly for health, hydration, and fatigue, as their condition directly influenced the speed and reliability of supply. Officers coordinated these movements with careful attention to schedules, contingencies, and environmental factors. Small lapses in logistics, miscalculated loads, neglected animal care, delayed departures could cascade into operational complications, emphasizing the necessity of procedural rigor. Even minor patrols demanded detailed preparation and thorough documentation. Soldiers recorded terrain features, vegetation patterns, and landmarks, updating maps and noting anomalies. Reports detailed distances traveled, minor encounters, and deviations from anticipated conditions. Officers reviewed these logs, correcting errors and reinforcing operational standards. While patrols often seemed mundane, their cumulative effect was critical to situational awareness and risk mitigation. A minor oversight in observation could have repercussions that extended far beyond the immediate moment, making precision and repetition essential. Social cohesion and informal hierarchies continued to influence operational stability. Respect was earned through competence, reliability, and adherence to routine. Officers like Carton de Wiart, whose personal history and visible injuries demonstrated experience and resilience, modeled discipline without overt enforcement. Soldiers internalized these lessons, creating networks of mutual accountability alongside formal rank structures. This social reinforcement stabilized morale and encouraged the consistent execution of procedural routines, particularly during long stretches of monotony, punctuated by environmental or logistical challenges. Maintenance tasks, though repetitive, remained critical to survival and operational functionality. Walkways were repaired, drainage channels reinforced, and shelter support strengthened. Each minor observation, decay in a board, soil erosion beneath a trench, or weakening of a tent stake, was documented and addressed promptly. Officers ensured that logs were updated and that resources were allocated to prevent further deterioration. The cumulative effect of these tasks preserved both structures, hull integrity, and personnel safety. Operational effectiveness depended on the constant, disciplined repetition of these small, often overlooked actions. Fatigue management was structured and deliberate. Soldiers rotated between labor, patrol, meals, and rest to prevent overexertion and maintain readiness. Officers monitored adherence, ensuring that minor deviations, insufficient rest, delayed inspections, or missed meals did not accumulate into functional impairments. Procedural discipline and routine consistency were used as tools to sustain endurance, enabling soldiers to perform effectively even under prolonged physical and environmental stress. Repetition, rather than improvisation, was the primary mechanism of resilience. Medical vigilance continued as a central concern. Minor injuries, fatigue, and early signs of illness were addressed promptly. Field hospitals provided bandaging, splinting, and surgical interventions when necessary. Officers enforced hygiene and preventative care rigorously, understanding that the cumulative effect of small lapses could compromise unit functionality. Procedural consistency in health management allowed soldiers to maintain operational readiness over extended periods, illustrating the importance of repetitive, disciplined attention to detail. Environmental adaptation remained ongoing. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter arrangements, and labor schedules in response to shifts in temperature, precipitation, and terrain conditions. Observations of water levels, soil moisture, and vegetation informed patrols, supply movements, and maintenance tasks. Officers integrated these insights into broader operational planning, emphasizing that minor environmental factors could have significant cumulative consequences. The persistence of procedural diligence in the face of environmental uncertainty was essential for sustaining both survival and effectiveness. Through these repetitive, methodical routines, inspection, maintenance, environmental observation, procedural drills, and careful labor, soldiers preserved the fragile equilibrium that allowed survival and operational functionality. Success was measured in the reliable execution of minor cumulative tasks rather than conspicuous acts of heroism. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified the integration of endurance, meticulous oversight, and consistent engagement with routine tasks. The quiet labor of daily life, though unremarkable, formed the foundation of resilience and operational effectiveness. Yet, despite adherence to these procedures, uncertainty persisted. Minor environmental changes, logistical delays, illness, or unanticipated skirmishes had the potential to disrupt the fragile balance of daily routines. Soldiers and officers navigated these challenges with methodical care, but lingering questions remained. How would this system withstand compounded pressures, and would unexpected variables expose vulnerabilities? Even in a sector of war defined more by quiet labor than dramatic engagements, the answer remained unknown, leaving all involved in a state of cautious vigilance and ongoing procedural diligence. As autumn deepened in the western sector, the rhythms of camp life settled into a routine defined by endurance, observation, and meticulous attention to detail. The mornings grew chillier, and fog lingered longer in valleys and low-lying areas, settling on tents, wooden shelters, and the ground itself. Moisture clung to blankets, boots, and clothing, while the faint scent of wood smoke, wet earth, and feed for animals permeated the air. Soldiers moved with deliberate precision, inspecting gear and clothing, layering for warmth, and performing minor maintenance tasks. Officers like Carton de Wiart circulated among the men, observing details that might otherwise go unnoticed. A sagging tent flap, a slight lean in a shelter support, or an early sign of foot injury. Each minor observation was recorded and integrated into broader operational awareness, underscoring the criticality of repeated, careful attention to everyday conditions. Inspection and maintenance of personal equipment remained central to the day. Soldiers cleaned rifles and sidearms, reassembled weapons and checked ammunition. Boots were inspected for moisture, socks for early signs of trench foot, and uniforms for wear or tear. Officers corrected mistakes, demonstrated proper techniques, and reinforced the necessity of repetition. Even minor oversights, misaligned straps, improperly stored ammunition, or a slightly bent bayonet, had the potential to compromise efficiency or safety. Repeated procedural diligence ensured that such small errors were caught before they could escalate into operational problems, and that habits of precision became ingrained over time. Camp infrastructure and defensive positions continued to demand constant attention. Wooden walkways were inspected and repaired, drainage channels cleared, and temporary shelters reinforced. Engineers monitored soil stability, assessing erosion patterns, water pooling, and load-bearing capacities. Minor structural weaknesses were recorded and addressed promptly. Soldiers performed these tasks with methodical care, understanding that small, cumulative failures could have significant consequences. Officers maintained oversight, ensuring that procedural rigor was consistently applied and that every minor observation informed broader operational planning. Food and water management remained highly structured. Rations of bread, dried meat, tinned vegetables, and occasionally fresh produce were distributed according to schedule, monitored by officers for both quantity and quality. Water was drawn from wells or streams, filtered, boiled, and rationed with care. Minor mismanagement, spillage, spoilage, or uneven allocation could reduce energy, morale, or overall operational efficiency. Soldiers consumed meals at prescribed times, balancing nutritional intake with readiness for labor and patrol duties. Officers emphasized that the accumulation of small, careful actions was essential for long-term survival and the functionality of the unit. Sanitation and preventative medical care continued as priorities. Latrines were inspected and relocated as necessary, bedding rotated or aired, and clothing laundered and repaired. Soldiers were checked for foot injuries, minor wounds, and early signs of illness. Field hospitals addressed more serious cases with bandaging, splinting, and basic surgical interventions. Officers enforced strict adherence to hygiene protocols, emphasizing prevention over reaction. Even minor lapses in these routines could compromise multiple personnel, illustrating the importance of repeated attention to the smallest details in sustaining operational effectiveness. Environmental awareness remained crucial. Fog, rain, and temperature fluctuations affected visibility, mobility, and comfort. Soldiers recorded river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation density, integrating observations into patrol planning, supply scheduling, and labor assignments. Officers used this data to make informed decisions, understanding that minor environmental changes could have cumulative operational consequences. The integration of careful observation with procedural diligence formed the backbone of survival and sustained readiness in a sector where the terrain and climate were unpredictable. Training and drills were repeated systematically. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, small unit maneuvers, and emergency procedures. Officers emphasized accuracy, consistency, and procedural memory over speed or spectacle. Muscle memory ensured that soldiers could perform reliably under fatigue or stress. Carton de Wiart's presence would have reinforced the value of repetition, observation, and endurance, demonstrating that cumulative small actions often determined the effectiveness of the unit more than dramatic engagements or extraordinary acts. Logistical coordination continued to present ongoing challenges. Wagons carried rations, ammunition, and equipment along roads vulnerable to wear, weather, and minor flooding. Drivers maintained meticulous records of loads, distances traveled, and the condition of horses and mules. Animals were checked repeatedly for hydration, fatigue, and health, as their condition directly influenced the speed and reliability of supply. Officers coordinated schedules, anticipating delays and maintaining redundancy. Small errors, overloaded wagons, poorly fed animals, or misrecorded inventories could cascade into operational complications, reinforcing the necessity of rigorous procedural adherence and detailed observation. Patrols, even when uneventful, required thorough preparation and precise documentation. Soldiers mapped terrain, noted vegetation changes, and recorded landmarks. Deviations from expected conditions were logged and reviewed. Officers cross-referenced these observations with prior records, ensuring accuracy and continuity. Although these patrols often appeared mundane, their cumulative impact on situational awareness, route planning, and risk management was substantial. Even a minor oversight could have amplified consequences, highlighting the importance of repeated, careful attention to detail. Social cohesion and informal hierarchies reinforced operational stability. Soldiers earned respect through reliability, competence, and adherence to routines. Officers like Carton de Wiart modeled discipline and endurance, with personal experience and visible scars lending authority. Soldiers internalized these standards, forming networks of mutual accountability alongside formal rank. This social reinforcement stabilized morale, ensured procedural compliance, and provided resilience during monotony or environmental challenges. Maintenance tasks, though repetitive, remained critical. Wooden walkways were repaired, drainage channels cleared, and shelters reinforced continuously. Minor observations, decay in a board, soil erosion beneath a trench, or leaning supports, were logged and addressed promptly. Officers oversaw documentation and resource allocation, preventing deterioration from accumulating into failure. The effectiveness of the unit relied on continuous, methodical attention to seemingly insignificant details, rather than on sporadic, heroic interventions. Fatigue and workload were managed carefully. Soldiers rotated between labor, patrols, meals, and rest, preventing overexertion and maintaining readiness. Officers monitored adherence to rotations, ensuring minor lapses, delayed meals, missed inspections, or insufficient rest did not accumulate into critical deficits. Procedural discipline and structured routines sustained both physical and mental endurance, allowing soldiers to function effectively under continuous, incremental demands. Medical vigilance persisted as a central concern. Minor injuries and early signs of illness were addressed promptly, while field hospitals managed more severe cases. Hygiene protocols, preventative care, and consistent inspection minimized the risk of widespread incapacitation. Officers emphasized that the cumulative effect of disciplined attention to health could outweigh the impact of isolated medical interventions, sustaining operational capacity over time. Environmental adaptation remained constant. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and labor schedules in response to changes in temperature, precipitation, and terrain. Observations of rivers, soil, and vegetation informed planning, patrols, and supply movements. Officers integrated these insights into operational strategies, emphasizing that even minor environmental variations could have significant cumulative effects on survival and efficiency. Consistent, disciplined adaptation formed the foundation for resilience in an unpredictable setting. Reflecting on this period, it becomes evident that the true measure of effectiveness on this front was not the number of engagements or casualties avoided, but the ability to maintain stability, health, and operational functionality through repetitive, meticulous attention to minor tasks. Soldiers who followed routine diligently, observed environmental cues, and adhered to procedural guidance created a foundation for endurance that allowed both themselves and their units to persist under prolonged stress. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified this principle, demonstrating that careful oversight, attention to detail, and endurance were more decisive than sporadic acts of heroism. Ultimately, the legacy of these routines lies in the demonstration that ordinary labor and consistent observation can shape outcomes as profoundly as tactical brilliance or dramatic feats. The repetitive, unremarkable work of maintaining camp infrastructure performing inspections, monitoring health, and observing environmental conditions was indispensable to operational resilience. Soldiers and officers alike navigated cumulative challenges through endurance, discipline, and procedural vigilance, leaving a historical imprint defined less by dramatic events and more by the quiet, continuous execution of essential tasks. As the days grew shorter and frost began to edge the ground, soldiers continued their routines, performing the small repeated actions that sustained life and operational readiness. Maintenance, observation, healthcare, and procedural drills were repeated with precision, forming a web of interdependent labor that allowed the unit to function. The quiet, persistent work of ordinary survival, so often overlooked in historical narratives, demonstrated that the measure of resilience and effectiveness often resides in cumulative, disciplined attention to the minutiae of daily life. Moving from the disciplined routines of the Western sector, we now shift focus to a quieter, more remote theater, where military life unfolded with similar reliance on observation, endurance, and meticulous attention to detail. Here, in the scattered villages and low hills of a sparsely populated region, soldiers faced challenges less obvious than direct engagement, yet no less consequential. Survival, operational efficiency, and the maintenance of health and morale depended on procedural repetition, environmental awareness, and the quiet labor of daily existence. In the early stages of deployment, camps were established on slightly elevated terrain to ensure drainage, visibility, and defensibility. Officers conducted careful surveys, measuring slopes, soil stability, and proximity to fresh water. Tents and temporary wooden shelters were erected with precise spacing, attention to anchoring, and orientation to prevailing winds and sun patterns. Even minor deviations, an uneven tent, a misaligned support beam, or a poorly dug drainage ditch were noted and corrected. Carton de Wiart, or an officer of comparable meticulous habit, would have overseen each step, ensuring that the repetition of proper procedure became habitual and internalized among soldiers. Daily routines began before sunrise. Soldiers moved from sleep to preparation with deliberate steps, layering clothing for warmth, inspecting boots, cleaning weapons, and checking ammunition. Officers supervised the process, correcting minor errors and demonstrating proper techniques. Even seemingly trivial oversights, such as a slightly bent bayonet, a loose strap, or improperly stored cartridges, could accumulate into operational inefficiency or safety risks. Repetition and attention to detail were instilled as essential skills, forming habits that supported survival in both predictable and unexpected circumstances. Food, and water management followed structured protocols. Rations consisted of bread, dried or salted meat, tinned vegetables, and occasionally fresh produce sourced locally. Officers monitored distribution, checking for quality, quantity, and equitable allocation. Water was collected, filtered, boiled when possible, and rationed carefully. Soldiers adhered to scheduled meal times, balancing nutrition, energy conservation, and readiness for labor or patrols. Minor errors, spilled rations, spoilage, or uneven distribution, could compromise health, morale, and operational effectiveness. Procedural adherence ensured that these small but cumulative risks were minimized. Hygiene and preventative medical care were central to sustaining operational capacity. Latrines were regularly inspected and relocated as needed, bedding rotated or aired, and clothing laundered when feasible. Soldiers were checked for minor wounds, signs of infection, or early indicators of fatigue-related illness. Field hospitals treated more serious cases, performing bandaging, splinting, and rudimentary surgical procedures. Officers enforced strict adherence to hygiene and care protocols, understanding that minor lapses could impact multiple personnel and compromise the unit's overall functionality. Procedural discipline was as crucial as physical labor in maintaining survival. Environmental monitoring informed nearly every decision. Rain, fog, temperature fluctuations, and soil conditions affected mobility, visibility, and comfort. Soldiers recorded river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation density to inform route selection, supply movements, and labor assignments. Officers analyzed these observations to anticipate challenges and adjust operational plans. The cumulative effect of repeated environmental monitoring ensured preparedness, highlighting the necessity of meticulous attention to minor details and sustaining both safety and operational capacity. Training and repetitive drills remained essential. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, emergency maneuvers, and small unit coordination. Officers emphasized precision, consistency, and procedural memory over speed or flair. Repetition embedded muscle memory, enabling predictable and reliable performance under stress. Carton de Wiart's leadership, characterized by meticulous oversight and attention to endurance, exemplified the principle that cumulative, disciplined practice often outweighed isolated displays of bravery in determining operational effectiveness. Logistical management continued to demand constant attention. Wagons transported rations, ammunition, and equipment along dirt roads, paths susceptible to weather and wear. Drivers meticulously recorded distances, loads, and animal condition. Horses and mules were inspected repeatedly, with their health directly impacting supply reliability. Officers coordinated schedules, anticipating delays and compensating for contingencies. Small errors in load management, animal care, or record keeping could propagate into larger disruptions, emphasizing the necessity of methodical, repeated oversight in sustaining operations. Even routine patrols required careful preparation. Soldiers observed terrain, vegetation, and landmarks, documenting minor variations and deviations from expected conditions. Reports detailed distances traveled, unusual features, and potential obstacles. Officers cross-checked these logs against previous records to maintain situational awareness. While patrols often appeared uneventful, their cumulative effect on environmental familiarity, risk assessment, and operational planning was substantial. A minor observational error could escalate into unforeseen difficulty, reinforcing the importance of procedural vigilance. Social dynamics within the camp reinforced operational stability. Respect and authority were earned through demonstrated competence, reliability, and adherence to routines. Officers like Carton de Wiart served as exemplars of endurance and procedural diligence, with personal experience and visible scars lending credibility to their guidance. Soldiers internalized these behaviors, forming networks of mutual accountability that supplemented formal rank structures. This cohesion supported morale, encouraged adherence to routine, and enhanced resilience during monotonous or stressful periods. Maintenance tasks, though repetitive, were critical to operational integrity. Walkways were repaired, drainage channels cleared, and shelters reinforced continuously. Minor defects, decaying boards, soil erosion, leaning posts, were recorded and addressed promptly. Officers supervised documentation and allocated resources to prevent the accumulation of damage. The consistent execution of these tasks ensured structural stability and personnel safety. Operational effectiveness relied on the unglamorous, repetitive labor of many small actions rather than occasional heroic efforts. Fatigue management relied on structured rotations. Soldiers alternated between labor, patrols, meals, and rest, preventing overexertion while maintaining readiness. Officers monitored adherence closely, mitigating minor lapses that could compound into larger functional deficits. Procedural discipline and predictable routines formed the backbone of endurance, enabling soldiers to sustain attention, labor, and vigilance despite cumulative physical and environmental stresses. Medical oversight remained integral. Minor injuries were treated promptly, and early symptoms of illness were addressed to prevent escalation. Field hospitals provided bandaging, splinting, and emergency interventions when necessary. Hygiene protocols and preventative care were enforced rigorously by officers. The cumulative effect of repeated medical attention and discipline maintained operational capacity and allowed soldiers to perform consistently over extended periods, emphasizing the critical intersection of health, observation, and routine. Environmental adaptation continued as a constant concern. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and labor schedules to accommodate temperature fluctuations, precipitation, and terrain conditions. Observations of river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation growth informed patrols, supply transport, and structural maintenance. Officers incorporated these observations into broader planning, ensuring that even minor environmental shifts did not compromise operational stability. Continuous, disciplined attention to these details supported both survival and functionality in a remote theater. Through repetitive inspections, maintenance, environmental observation, training, and labor, soldiers preserved the delicate balance between survival and operational efficiency. Success was measured not in dramatic events, but in the cumulative effect of minor, consistent actions. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified this principle, demonstrating that careful oversight, endurance, and persistent attention to routine created a foundation for resilience. Quiet, repetitive labor formed the bedrock of survival, operational capacity, and ultimately, historical impact. Yet even with careful adherence to procedure, uncertainty persisted. Environmental fluctuations, logistical challenges, minor injuries, or unexpected incidents could disrupt the fragile balance of camp life. Soldiers and officers navigated these challenges with discipline and awareness, but the overarching question remained: how would the system respond if compounding variables arose simultaneously? Even in a relatively quiet theater, the fragility of survival underscored the necessity of continuous vigilance, repetition, and methodical attention to detail. As autumn deepened across this remote sector, daily life in the camps became defined by repetition, observation, and the careful management of both resources and human energy. Soldiers rose before dawn, moving through cold, damp shelters, adjusting layers of clothing for warmth, and attending to personal equipment. Boots were dried and inspected, clothing checked for tears or moisture, and weapons meticulously cleaned and reassembled. Officers like Carton de Wiart circulated among the men, scrutinizing minor details: a sagging tent flap, an uneven board, a small tear in canvas, or early signs of foot injury. Each minor observation was recorded, noted, and integrated into future planning, reinforcing the importance of continuous procedural vigilance. Inspection of personal equipment remained a routine yet critical task. Soldiers checked rifles, bayonets, sidearms, and ammunition, ensuring that even the smallest components were functional. Officers corrected mistakes, demonstrated proper technique, and emphasized repetition as both a preventative and preparatory measure. Minor oversights, misaligned straps, loose ammunition, or slightly bent bayonets, had the potential to compromise safety or operational efficiency. Through repeated practice and careful attention, soldiers internalized precision and diligence, creating habits that would support endurance in unpredictable conditions. Camp infrastructure required constant care. Wooden walkways, temporary shelters, and drainage channels were inspected, repaired, and reinforced. Engineers measured soil stability, monitored erosion, and adjusted supports as needed. Even minor structural weaknesses were documented and addressed immediately. Soldiers performed these tasks methodically, understanding that seemingly insignificant failures could accumulate into major disruptions. Officers ensured that procedural oversight remained consistent, reinforcing the principle that survival depended on the meticulous execution of repetitive, small-scale labor. Food and water management was strictly regulated. Rations, primarily bread, dried meat, and tinned vegetables, supplemented with fresh local produce when available, were distributed according to schedule. Officers checked both quantity and quality, ensuring equitable distribution and minimizing waste. Water was filtered, boiled when fuel permitted, and rationed. Soldiers consumed meals at predetermined intervals, balancing caloric intake with the energy demands of labor and patrols. Small errors in rationing, spillage, spoilage, or uneven allocation could reduce energy, compromise morale, or interfere with operational readiness. Procedural adherence ensured the cumulative risks remained manageable. Sanitation and preventative medical care remained high priorities. Latrines were regularly relocated and inspected. Bedding was aired, rotated, and occasionally laundered. Clothing was repaired or replaced when necessary. Soldiers were checked for minor injuries, early signs of illness, or fatigue-related conditions, Field hospitals addressed more serious cases with bandaging, splinting, and basic surgical interventions. Officers enforced rigorous hygiene standards, emphasizing prevention over reaction. Even minor lapses could impact multiple personnel, demonstrating that procedural vigilance in health management was as vital as labor or fortification work. Environmental awareness shaped nearly every decision. Soldiers monitored fog, rainfall, soil moisture, river levels, and vegetation density, incorporating observations into patrol planning, labor assignments, and supply scheduling. Officers analyzed these data, adjusting strategies to minimize risk and maintain efficiency. Minor changes in weather or terrain could accumulate to affect mobility, say, FETI and resource management. The repeated observation and integration of these details exemplified the critical intersection of endurance, attention, and adaptability. Training and drills continued as a foundation of operational readiness. Soldiers repeatedly practiced weapon handling, signaling, emergency maneuvers, and small unit coordination. Officers emphasized procedural consistency and muscle memory over speed or showmanship. Repetition enabled soldiers to respond reliably under stress, fatigue, or minor injury. Carton de Wiart's leadership, characterized by meticulous oversight, patience, and resilience, reinforced the notion that sustained, methodical practice determined operational effectiveness more than isolated acts of bravery. Logistical coordination remained a constant challenge. Wagons carried rations, ammunition, and equipment along dirt paths prone to erosion, puddling, and wear. Drivers documented distances, loads, and animal condition meticulously. Horses and mules were inspected several times daily, as their health directly affected supply reliability. Officers coordinated schedules, anticipating delays, rerouting when necessary, and maintaining contingency plans. Minor oversights, overloaded wagons, neglected feeding, or inaccurate record-keeping could propagate into larger operational disruptions, emphasizing the importance of disciplined, repetitive management. Even routine patrols demanded careful planning and detailed documentation. Soldiers recorded terrain features, vegetation changes, and landmarks, noting any deviations from expected conditions. Reports included distances traveled, minor obstacles encountered, and any unusual environmental factors. Officers cross-referenced these records with previous patrols to maintain continuity and situational awareness. While seemingly mundane, the cumulative effect of these patrols was significant, supporting risk assessment, planning, and overall operational resilience. Social cohesion within the unit reinforced procedural compliance and morale. Soldiers earned respect through reliability, competence, and adherence to routine. Officers like Carton de Wiart modeled endurance, discipline, and meticulous attention to detail, their personal experience and visible injuries lending authority to their guidance. Soldiers internalized these expectations, forming informal networks of accountability alongside formal hierarchies. This cohesion encouraged consistent performance, mitigated stress, and enhanced the overall stability of the unit in an environment defined by repetition and subtle challenges. Maintenance tasks, though repetitive, remained vital. Walkways were repaired, drainage channels reinforced, and shelters strengthened continuously. Minor observations, such as decay in a board, soil erosion beneath a trench, or a leaning support post, were logged and addressed. Officers supervised documentation and ensured resources were allocated appropriately. The cumulative effect of these small actions preserved structural stability and personnel safety. Operational functionality depended more on the diligent repetition of minor tasks than on sporadic, heroic efforts. Fatigue management was structured and deliberate. Soldiers rotated through labor, patrols, meals, and rest periods to prevent overexertion and maintain readiness. Officers monitored adherence, mitigating minor lapses such as delayed meals, missed inspections, or insufficient rest, which could otherwise compound into functional deficits. Procedural discipline and predictable routines formed the foundation of physical and mental endurance, allowing soldiers to maintain performance despite continuous, incremental stresses. Medical oversight continued to be central. Minor injuries were addressed promptly. early symptoms of illness were monitored, and field hospitals managed more serious cases with bandaging, splinting, and rudimentary surgical care. Hygiene, preventative protocols, and consistent inspection minimized the risk of incapacitation. Officers emphasized the cumulative impact of repeated attention to health, demonstrating that endurance and operational readiness depended as much on methodical care as on labor or tactical planning. Environmental adaptation remained a persistent concern. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and labor schedules in response to temperature, precipitation, and terrain conditions. Observations of soil, water, and vegetation were integrated into planning for patrols, supply, and maintenance. Officers incorporated these data into operational strategy, recognizing that minor environmental shifts could significantly affect overall functionality. Sustained attention to detail in response to environmental conditions formed a critical component of survival. Through repetitive inspections, maintenance, labor, observation, and adherence to procedural discipline, soldiers maintained a delicate equilibrium between survival and operational effectiveness. Success was rarely dramatic. It depended on the cumulative effect of small, consistent actions performed with diligence. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified endurance, meticulous oversight, and sustained engagement with routine tasks, illustrating that quiet, repetitive labor was foundational to both survival and historical impact. Yet, even under careful adherence to procedure, uncertainty persisted. Environmental fluctuations, logistical complications, minor injuries, or unanticipated incidents could disrupt the fragile balance. Soldiers and officers navigated these challenges methodically, but lingeringly, and questions remained. How resilient was the system under compounded stress, and how would it respond to unforeseen variables? Even in this relatively quiet theater, the persistence of vigilance, repetition, and attention to detail remained the decisive factor in sustaining life and operational capability. As the late autumn days wore on in this remote sector, the rhythm of camp life remained structured, deliberate, and defined by repetition. Soldiers emerged before dawn, moving through cold, damp shelters and preparing for the day's labor with measured care. Clothing was layered to maintain warmth, boots inspected for moisture, socks checked for early signs of injury, and weapons meticulously cleaned, reassembled, and accounted for. Officers like Carton de Wiart circulated throughout the camp, noting details that could influence survival: a sagging tent flap, a loose support beam, minor soil erosion beneath walkways, or the earliest signs of fatigue or minor illness among the men. Each observation was documented, integrated into operational planning, and used to reinforce procedural adherence across the unit. Inspection of personal equipment continued to be a critical focus. Soldiers examined rifles, bayonets, sidearms, and ammunition, checking for minor wear or damage. Officers corrected mistakes and demonstrated proper techniques, emphasizing repetition as both a preventive measure and a way to embed procedural habits. Even trivial oversights, slightly bent bayonets, loose ammunition pouches, or minor alignment issues with straps, could compromise readiness. The repeated practice of careful inspection instilled a sense of precision and responsibility, ensuring that soldiers developed habits capable of sustaining endurance under unpredictable conditions. Camp infrastructure required constant attention. Walkways were repaired, shelters reinforced, and drainage channels cleared. Engineers assessed soil stability, measured erosion, and adjusted supports as necessary. Even minor structural weaknesses were logged and promptly addressed. Soldiers carried out these tasks methodically, understanding that small cumulative errors could escalate into operational hazards. Setax oversaw these activities, ensuring that standards were maintained and that attention to detail was continuous. Survival in this sector depended as much on repetitive labor as on preparedness or tactical knowledge. Food and water management continued under strict procedural oversight. Rations, primarily bread, dried meat, and tinned vegetables with occasional fresh produce, were distributed on schedule. Officers monitored quantity and quality to ensure equitable distribution and minimize waste. Water was collected, filtered, and boiled where possible, with rationing enforced according to need and circumstance. Soldiers consumed meals at designated intervals, balancing energy expenditure with readiness for labor or patrols. Minor errors in ration management, spillage, spoilage, or uneven allocation could diminish morale, energy, and operational efficiency, reinforcing the importance of procedural adherence in sustaining cumulative effectiveness. Sanitation and preventative medical care remained central to operational stability. Latrines were inspected and relocated when necessary, bedding rotated or aired, and clothing repaired or replaced. Soldiers were examined for minor injuries, signs of infection, or fatigue-related conditions. Field hospitals addressed more serious injuries with bandaging, splinting, and rudimentary surgical procedures. Officers enforced rigorous adherence to hygiene and care protocols, recognizing that even minor lapses could impact multiple individuals. Procedural discipline in health management became a core mechanism for sustaining readiness. Environmental monitoring shaped operational planning and decision-making. Soldiers observed temperature fluctuations, rainfall, fog, river levels, and vegetation density, integrating this data into patrol routes, labor assignments, and supply planning. Officers analyzed trends and adapted schedules to account for subtle changes, ensuring that minor environmental variations did not escalate into operational challenges. Continuous observation and adaptation reinforced the critical relationship between endurance, procedural diligence, and situational awareness. Training and drills were repeated with precision and focus. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, emergency maneuvers, and small unit coordination. Officers emphasized accuracy, consistency, and procedural memory, reinforcing the concept that repetition was essential for reliable performance under fatigue or stress. Carton de Wiart's presence embodied the value of sustained attention to detail, endurance, and meticulous oversight, demonstrating that cumulative practice often determined operational success more than isolated acts of conspicuous bravery. Logistics management remained an ongoing concern. Wagons transported rations, ammunition, and equipment along dirt paths susceptible to erosion, puddling, and minor blockages. Drivers maintained detailed logs of distances, loads, and animal condition. Horses and mules were inspected multiple times per day, as their health directly influenced the speed and reliability of supply chains. Officers coordinated movements, anticipated delays, and maintained contingency measures. Even small errors, overloading, inadequate feeding, or inaccurate record-keeping, could propagate into larger operational complications, emphasizing the necessity of procedural discipline and attention to cumulative detail. Patrols required careful preparation and documentation. Soldiers recorded terrain features, vegetation changes, and landmarks, noting deviations from expected conditions. Reports detailed distances, minor obstacles, and environmental anomalies. Officers cross-referenced these with previous patrols, maintaining continuity and situational awareness. Although these patrols often appeared uneventful, the cumulative effect on operational intelligence, risk assessment, and planning was significant. Even a small oversight could have consequences beyond the immediate moment, reinforcing the importance of repetitive diligence. Social cohesion within the camp was a stabilizing force. Soldiers earned respect through reliability, competence, and adherence to routine. Officers like Carton de Wiart demonstrated endurance and meticulous attention to detail, their personal experience and visible scars lending authority. Soldiers internalized these behaviors, forming informal networks of accountability that complemented formal hierarchy. This cohesion supported morale, ensured consistent adherence to routine, and enhanced resilience in an environment defined by repetition and subtle challenges. Maintenance tasks remained essential despite their monotony. Walkways were repaired, drainage channels cleared, and shelters reinforced continuously. Minor defects, decay, erosion, or leaning supports were logged and addressed promptly. Officers supervised documentation and ensured resources were allocated appropriately. The cumulative effect of these small actions preserved structural stability, safety, and operational efficiency. Functional success relied on repeated, careful labor rather than sporadic heroic intervention. Fatigue management followed structured rotations. Soldiers alternated between labor, patrols, meals, and rest, preventing overexertion and sustaining readiness. Officers monitored adherence, mitigating minor lapses, delayed meals, missed inspections, insufficient rest that could otherwise accumulate into operational deficits. Procedural discipline and consistent routines formed the backbone of endurance, allowing soldiers to maintain effectiveness under persistent, incremental stresses. Medical oversight remained central to operational resilience. Minor injuries were treated promptly, early signs of illness were monitored, and field hospitals managed more serious cases with bandaging, splinting, and basic surgical interventions. Hygiene protocols, preventative care, and consistent inspection minimized the risk of widespread incapacitation. Officers emphasized that the cumulative effect of repeated attention to health could outweigh isolated interventions, sustaining operational functionality over time. Environmental adaptation continued to be necessary. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and work schedules to accommodate changes in temperature, precipitation, and terrain conditions. Observations of soil, water, and vegetation were integrated into planning for patrols, maintenance, and supply movement. Officers incorporated these data into operational strategy, understanding that even minor environmental changes could significantly affect readiness and stability. Repetitive, disciplined attention to environmental factors remained crucial for survival. Through continuous repetition, observation, maintenance, and procedural adherence, soldiers preserved a delicate balance between survival and operational effectiveness. The measure of success rested not on dramatic events, but on the cumulative impact of small, disciplined actions. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified the integration of endurance, meticulous oversight, and sustained engagement with routine tasks, demonstrating that quiet, persistent labor formed the foundation of resilience. Even in a sector largely free of major engagements, these practices ensured both survival and functionality. Yet uncertainty persisted. Environmental fluctuations, minor injuries, logistical delays, or unanticipated incidents could disrupt the fragile equilibrium of daily life. Soldiers and officers managed these challenges methodically, but lingering questions remained. How resilient was this system under compounded stresses, and how would it respond to unforeseen disruptions? Even in a relatively calm theater, the necessity of vigilance, repetition, and attention to detail underscored the constant tension inherent in sustaining both life and operational capacity. As the late autumn days gave way to the first edge of winter, the rhythm of life in this remote sector remained defined by meticulous repetition, observation, and careful attention to the minor but cumulative factors that governed survival. Soldiers moved from sleep to labor with deliberate precision, layering clothing to combat the chill, inspecting boots and socks for dampness or early signs of injury, and attending to weapons and ammunition with painstaking care. Officers, following the example of figures like Carton de Wiart, circulated through the camp with a steady eye, noting minor details that might otherwise escape attention. Slight soil erosion beneath walkways, sagging supports on shelters, minor tears in canvas, or the faint beginnings of fatigue or illness among the men. Every observation was logged, cross-referenced with prior notes, and used to guide both immediate action and long-term planning, reinforcing the critical importance of procedural discipline. Inspection of personal equipment remained a central component of daily routine. Soldiers examined rifles, bayonets, sidearms, and ammunition for signs of wear or damage. Officers corrected mistakes, demonstrated proper handling techniques, and emphasized the importance of repetition in embedding habit and muscle memory. Even minor oversights, slightly bent bayonets, loose ammunition, or misaligned straps, could compromise readiness or operational efficiency. The cumulative effect of repeated, careful inspection was the internalization of precision and responsibility, essential traits for enduring the prolonged demands of a remote theater. Camp infrastructure required ongoing attention. Wooden walkways, shelters, and drainage channels were continuously inspected, repaired, and reinforced. Engineers monitored soil stability, measured erosion, and adjusted supports as needed. Minor structural weaknesses were logged and addressed promptly, preventing accumulation into serious hazards. Soldiers carried out these tasks methodically, understanding that their labor, though repetitive, maintained both safety and operational stability. Officers maintained oversight, ensuring procedural standards were followed consistently, emphasizing that survival was a function of attention to detail rather than occasional heroic effort. Food and water management continued under strict procedural oversight. Rations, bread, dried meat, tinned vegetables, and occasional local produce were distributed on a strict schedule. Officers monitored both quantity and quality, ensuring equitable allocation and minimizing waste. Water was drawn, filtered, boiled when possible, and rationed carefully. Soldiers consumed meals according to routine, balancing caloric intake with energy expenditure for labor and patrol duties. Minor lapses, spillage, spoilage, or misallocation could compromise both health and morale, demonstrating the significance of procedural consistency in sustaining operational effectiveness. Sanitation and preventative medical care remained priorities. Latrines were inspected and relocated when necessary, bedding rotated and aired, and clothing repaired or replaced. Soldiers were checked for minor injuries, early signs of illness, or fatigue-related symptoms. Field hospitals treated more serious cases with bandaging, splinting, and rudimentary surgical interventions. Officers enforced rigorous hygiene standards, emphasizing prevention over reaction. Even minor lapses in these routines could affect multiple personnel, highlighting the importance of continuous procedural attention. Environmental awareness continued to shape decision-making. Soldiers observed weather patterns, river levels, soil moisture, and vegetation density, incorporating this information into patrol planning, labor assignments, and supply scheduling. Officers analyzed these observations, adjusting routines and assignments to account for subtle changes. Minor environmental variations could cascade into operational challenges if overlooked, reinforcing the necessity of sustained observation and disciplined adaptation. Training and drills persisted with deliberate repetition. Soldiers practiced weapon handling, signaling, emergency maneuvers, and small unit coordination, emphasizing accuracy and procedural consistency. Officers prioritized muscle memory and reliability over speed or spectacle. Carton de Wiart's leadership, characterized by meticulous attention, endurance, and procedural diligence, demonstrated that cumulative practice and sustained observation were far more decisive than intermittent acts of conspicuous bravery. Logistics management remained a continuous concern. Wagons transported rations, ammunition, and equipment over terrain subject to erosion, puddling, and other minor obstacles. Drivers kept detailed logs of distances, loads, and animal condition, while officers monitored schedules, anticipating delays and maintaining contingencies. Even minor oversights, overloading, inadequate feeding, or misrecorded inventories could propagate into larger operational complications. Procedural discipline, consistent monitoring, and attention to detail were essential for maintaining supply reliability. Routine patrols demanded preparation and careful documentation. Soldiers noted terrain features, vegetation changes, and landmarks, recording deviations from expected conditions. Reports included distances traveled, minor obstacles encountered, and environmental anomalies. Officers cross-referenced these observations with prior patrols, ensuring continuity, situational awareness, and reliable planning. While patrols often appeared mundane, their cumulative effect on operational intelligence and risk mitigation was substantial. Even small oversights could have consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. Social cohesion reinforced operational stability. Soldiers earned respect through competence, reliability, and adherence to routine. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified endurance, meticulous observation, and procedural diligence, lending credibility through personal experience and visible injuries. Soldiers internalized these behaviors, forming informal accountability networks alongside formal rank structures. Cohesion encouraged consistent performance, mitigated stress, and strengthened resilience, particularly during prolonged monotony or minor environmental challenges. Maintenance, although repetitive, remained essential. Walkways were repaired, drainage channels cleared, and shelters reinforced. Minor defects, decay, erosion, or leaning posts were promptly documented and addressed. Officers supervised these tasks, ensuring resources were allocated and standards maintained. Cumulative attention to such details preserved structural integrity, personnel safety, and operational efficiency. The success of the unit relied on methodical labor, repeated consistently, rather than intermittent heroic intervention. Fatigue management was structured and deliberate. Soldiers rotated between labor, patrols, meals, and rest periods to prevent overexertion. Officers monitored compliance, mitigating minor lapses, missed inspections, delayed meals, or insufficient rest that could accumulate into functional deficits. Procedural discipline and predictable routines formed the backbone of physical and mental endurance, enabling soldiers to maintain performance under ongoing incremental stress. Medical oversight continued to underpin operational resilience. Minor injuries and early signs of illness were addressed promptly, while field hospitals treated more serious cases. Hygiene, preventative care, and consistent inspection reduced the likelihood of widespread incapacitation. Officers emphasized the cumulative effect of repeated medical attention, demonstrating that endurance and operational readiness were sustained as much through procedural diligence as through labor or tactical skill. Environmental adaptation remained ongoing. Soldiers adjusted clothing, shelter, and labor schedules to account for temperature fluctuations, precipitation, and terrain conditions. Observations of soil, water, and vegetation informed planning for patrols, supply, and maintenance. Officers integrated these data into strategic decision-making, emphasizing that minor environmental changes could cumulatively affect operational readiness. Sustained, disciplined attention to environmental factors remained a fundamental component of survival. Reflecting on this extended period, it is evident that the quiet, repetitive, and methodical labor of soldiers was the foundation of resilience, operational stability, and endurance. Success was measured not in dramatic feats, but in the cumulative impact of small, precise actions executed consistently. Officers like Carton de Wiart exemplified the integration of endurance, meticulous oversight, and disciplined procedural execution, demonstrating that sustained attention to minor details often outweighed intermittent acts of heroism in determining long-term effectiveness. Ultimately, the legacy of these routines highlights the significance of ordinary labor, structured observation, and procedural vigilance in military history. Soldiers who adhered to repetitive inspections, maintenance, environmental observation, and disciplined healthcare created a resilient framework that allowed survival and operational capacity to persist under prolonged stress. In theaters largely defined by the absence of major engagements, it was the accumulation of quiet, repetitive actions that shaped outcomes and left a lasting imprint on history. As the first frost settled on the ground and the days grew shorter, soldiers continued their cycles of labor, inspection, and observation. Each small, repeated act, repairing a walkway, checking ammunition, monitoring river levels, contributed to the cumulative stability of the unit. The quiet, persistent work of ordinary survival, though often overlooked in historical narratives, proved essential. It demonstrated that endurance, procedural discipline, and repeated attention to minor details were as decisive in shaping historical outcomes as any battlefield engagement.